Picture a high plain at the very end of the day, somewhere in the south of Peru, where the land has gone the color of warm ash and the light is leaving it slowly. There is no sound here, or almost none, no surf, no traffic, no wind to speak of, only the small dry creak of the heat going out of the ground as the sun lowers itself toward a flat, far horizon. The plain stretches away in every direction, level and open and enormous, a tableland of dark stones laid thin over pale earth, and the stones hold the last of the daylight in a dull red-brown glow before they let it go. This is the place people have come to call the Nazca Pampa, and there is nothing here you need to hold on to tonight, nothing that asks anything of you. Let the words come slowly at whatever pace the night allows, and let yourself drift down gently towards sleep. The marks we will visit are old ones, and they are patient. They have been lying here in the dry air for 2,000 years, and they are in no hurry now. Let us begin with the ground itself, because the ground is the whole of the story, and it is worth knowing before anything is drawn upon it. You are standing on a plateau in the Ica region of southern Peru, roughly 400 kilometers south of the capital city of Lima, in the long, thin band of desert that runs down the Pacific coast of South America. The plain has names more than one, the way large open places often do. To the people who study it, it is the Pampa de San Jose. On the maps it sometimes appears as the Pampa Colorada, the red plain, named for exactly the color you are looking at now, the dull rust red of those countless dark stones catching the low sun. It sits in the drainage of a river called the Rio Grande de Nazca, a river that gathers a handful of small valleys and carries what little water this country ever sees down toward the ocean. The whole of it lies between two small towns, Nazca to the south and Pampa to the north, and it is here, on this flat and stony tableland, that the marks were made. The first thing to understand about this place, the thing that makes everything else possible, is that it almost never rains. Nazca is one of the driest inhabited places on the entire planet. The figure that gets recorded year after year is an average of about 4 millimeters of rain in a year. 4 millimeters, that is not 4 millimeters in a month, or 4 millimeters in a single storm. That is the whole of the year's rainfall, gathered together, and it would not fill a bottle cap. Rain in this country is measured not in inches, but in minutes, a few minutes of drizzle perhaps once or twice a year, hardly enough to darken the dusk before it is gone again. There are places nearby where the rain gauges have stood empty for years on end. This is desert in its most absolute form, hyperarid, the land just to the north of the Great Atacama, which is itself the driest non-polar desert on Earth. And here is the quiet wonder of it. This dryness is not an accident, not a piece of bad luck. It is built into the machinery of the world, into the shape of the ocean and the shape of the mountains, and once you understand how it is made, you understand why the marks could last. The cause sits offshore in the water. Running up the western coast of South America from the cold seas near Antarctica toward the equator is one of the great ocean currents of the planet, the Humboldt Current, sometimes called the Peru Current, a vast slow river of cold water moving north along the coast. Cold water does a particular thing to the air above it. It chills the lowest layer of the atmosphere, and chilled air does not rise, and air that does not rise does not build the tall towering clouds that bring rain. So the moisture that the ocean offers up gets trapped down low, near the surface, as mist and fog and gray overcast, and it drifts ashore as a thin damp haze the Peruvians call the garua, but it almost never gathers into anything that can fall as real rain. The sea is right there, enormous and full of water, and yet the coast behind it stays dry as bone. And then on the other side there are the mountains. Inland from this plain rise the Andes, one of the great mountain walls of the world, and they do to the weather coming from the east what the cold current does to the weather coming from the west. Any moist air drifting in from the Amazon basin, far away across the continent, is forced upward by that enormous wall of rock, and it drops its rain on the eastern slopes, and by the time whatever is left crests the peaks and comes down the western side toward the coast, it has been wrung out completely. This is what is called a rain shadow, the dry sheltered country that lies behind a mountain range, in the lee of all that high stone. So the Nazca Pampa sits caught between two great dryers, the cold sea on one hand and the high mountains on the other, each of them stripping the moisture out of the air before it can ever reach the plain. The result is a place where, for thousands of years at a stretch, almost nothing falls from the sky. That low trapped sea mist, the garua, does sometimes reach the land, drifting in gray over the coastal hills in the winter months between roughly June and August, and where it touches certain slopes, it works a small green miracle, patches of fog-fed vegetation the Peruvians call lomas, little gardens of mist that bloom on otherwise barren hillsides, watered by nothing but the damp breath of the ocean. But the lomas cling only to the seaward hills where the fog first comes ashore. The high open Pampa where the lines lie is set back and lifted up, beyond the reach of even that thin gray moisture, and it stays bare. There is, too, one great exception that the makers themselves would have known, though it comes only rarely. Every so often, every handful of years or every few decades, the cold current weakens and warm water pushes down the coast in the event we now call El Niño, and then the rains can come hard and sudden to this dry country, and destructive flooding bursts. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule, the rare violent visitors that only sharpen, by contrast, how profoundly dry the ordinary years are. The ordinary years are simply still and cloudless and rainless, one after another, almost without end. Nothing falls and almost nothing moves. This is the second half of the gift. The Pampa is not only dry, it is also remarkably still and remarkably stable. The winds here are light, the same cool ocean air sits over the plain much of the time, gentle and steady, without the violent gusting storms that scour and reshape so many other deserts. The temperature is even moderated by that same nearby sea, rarely swinging to the brutal extremes you find in the great inland deserts of the world. There are no rivers crossing the plain to flood it, no rain to carve gullies into it, no sandstorms to bury it and uncover it again. Day after day, year after year, century after century, the surface of the Pampa de San Jose simply lies there in the dry, still air, almost untouched, almost unchanging, about as close to a thing that does not happen as the living surface of the earth ever comes. Now look down at what you're standing on, because the surface itself is the canvas, and it is a strange and particular kind of ground. Across the whole of this plain lies a thin scattered pavement of small stones and pebbles, and those stones are dark, a deep reddish brown, almost black in some lights, the color of old iron. That darkness is not the color of the stone itself. It is a coating, a thin skin built up over a very long time, and it has a name, desert varnish. Over thousands of years in the dry, still air, a fine film of iron and manganese oxides, rust essentially, and its darker cousin slowly accumulates on the upper surface of every exposed stone, drawn out and laid down grain by the trace of moisture in the night air and the action of microscopic life. The longer a stone lies undisturbed with its face to the sky, the darker that varnish grows. So the whole top layer of the Pampa, all those countless small pebbles, has been stained dark by time, a dull rust-red skin lying over everything. And beneath that dark skin, just beneath it, only a few centimeters down, the ground is pale. Lift away the dark stones, brush back the rusted pavement, and what you uncover is a soft subsoil the color of pale yellow-gray clay and gypsum, light as old bone, bright against the darkness around it. That is the entire secret of the place, the whole technique distilled into a single simple fact. You do not need paint here. You do not need to carry pigment or carve deep into rock or build anything up. You need only to move the dark stones aside and expose the pale ground beneath, and you have made a pale line on a dark plain, a line that, from the right distance, reads as clearly as chalk on a slate. The makers of the Nazca Lines did exactly that, and almost nothing more. They cleared the dark surface stones from a strip of ground, raked them into low borders along the edges, and let the pale subsoil show through, scooping their furrows only 10 to 15 centimeters deep, a few inches, no more. A pale line against a dark ground, that is what a Nazca line is in its plainest physical truth, not a thing added to the desert, but a thing taken away. A space where the dark stones are no longer. And because of everything we have already said about this place, the rain that does not fall, the wind that does not scour, the stable even air, those simple shallow lines did not vanish. In almost any other place on earth they would have. A pale scratch in the desert floor would be filled by blowing sand within a season, washed flat by the first hard rain, softened and erased within a generation. But not here. Here there is no rain to wash them and almost no wind to fill them, and the dark stones the makers raked aside do not creep back. So the lines stayed. Year after year, the dry, still air held them exactly as they were made, until the years became centuries, and the centuries became a span of time that is genuinely hard to hold in the mind, roughly 2,000 years. The people who cleared these stones did their patient work somewhere in the long stretch between about 100 years before the Common Era and the centuries after, the work of the culture we now call the Nazca, who flourished on this coast from around the 1st century before our era until perhaps 800 years after it, and before them, the Paracas people who left some of the oldest marks of all. They cleared the stones, and then their whole world passed away, their towns, their language, their gods, their names, all of it gone down into the same silence that takes everything, and still the lines remained, lying open to the sky, waiting, long after there was anyone left who remembered making them. And there is one more thing the dryness gave them, beyond mere survival. It gave them a workable canvas in the first place, and a forgiving one. On a plane this stable, you can lay out a line slowly over days and come back the next morning to find it exactly where you left it, the loose stones undisturbed, the pale furrow waiting. The straightness that seems so uncanny from the air turns out, when you think it through on the ground, to need no magic at all, only patience and the simplest of tools. Stretch a cord taut between two wooden stakes, sight along it, set a third stake far ahead in line with the first two, and walk the cleared path between them. Then move your stakes forward and do it again and again, and you can hold a true line across kilometers of open desert, over rises and into hollows, with nothing more than string and sticks and care. Researchers walking the Pampa have found the remains of just such wooden stakes still standing at the ends of some of the lines, and radiocarbon dating of that old wood is part of how we know when the work was done. The figures, the curving birds and the spiraling monkey's tail, are thought to have been laid out the same patient way, scaled up from small drawings by the steady stepping off of measured cords. No view from above was needed to make them. Only the willingness to work very large and very slowly, on a surface that would not move. That work seems to have been bound up with a great gathering place at the southern edge of the Pampa, a ceremonial center called Cahuachi, a sprawl of mounds and plazas built of adobe near the river, where the Nazca came together for their festivals and their rites. Many of the lines, when you trace them, seem to relate to Cahuachi and to the water and the mountains, as though the plain were a kind of vast open-air temple whose floor was walked rather than merely looked at. We will come back to that thought gently in a later hour. For now it is enough to know that the lines were not made in a void by no one for no reason. They were made by a real people with a real center to their world, who lived and farmed and worshipped along this dry coast, and who walked out onto the high plain to do this strange and patient thing. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of that, gently, as you lie here in the dark. Almost nothing that human hands make survives 2,000 years. Cities fall and are buried. Wood rots, cloth frays, metal corrodes back into the ground, paint flakes away, stone monuments topple and are quarried for other walls. The works of even the greatest ancient peoples come down to us mostly as fragments, as foundations and potsherds and the worn stumps of things. And yet here, on this one quiet plain, the most fragile-seeming gesture imaginable, the mere brushing aside of loose stones, has outlasted nearly all of it, perfectly legible, because it happened to be made in the one kind of place patient enough and still enough to keep it. The marks survive not because they were made to be permanent, but because the desert simply declined to take them back. There is something almost tender in that when you think about it slowly, a plain so quiet that even the lightest touch upon it endures. The world recognized as much in the end. In 1994, the lines in the surrounding Pampa were named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, set down on the short list of places judged precious to all of humankind, protected now precisely because they are so fragile, because a single careless tire track across that dark pavement could scar the plain for centuries, where the rain that would heal any other ground will never come to heal this one. The scale of the thing is hard to take in as well, and we can let the numbers drift past softly without needing to keep them. The marks are not a single drawing in a single spot. They are spread across a vast stretch of the Pampa, the heart of them covering some 50 square kilometers, scattered across a far larger expanse of plain than that, hundreds of square kilometers of high desert all told, and there are a great many of them. If you were to add together all the lines on the Pampa, every straight line, every long ruled avenue, every edge of every shape, the total comes to well over 1,000 kilometers of cleared ground. More than 1,300 kilometers of lines, by the usual reckoning, raked one stone at a time across a plain where it almost never rains. Some of them run dead straight for kilometers at a time, arrow straight across hills and hollows, holding their bearing with an exactness that is genuinely difficult to explain. Others gather into broad open shapes, great trapezoids and triangles cleared clean of their dark stones, like runways for something that never came. And among them, scattered across the plain, are the figures, the famous ones, the drawings of living things, each one rendered as a single unbroken line. A hummingbird with its long beak stretched 90-odd meters from tail to tip, a monkey with a great spiraling tail, a spider, a condor with its wings spread well over 100 meters wide, a heron, a pelican, a dog, a curious figure with one hand of 4 fingers and one of 5. They are enormous, every one of them so large that no person standing on the ground among them could ever take in the whole shape at once. From down on the Pampa where you're standing now, a figure 90 meters long is not a picture of anything. It is only a shallow groove in the desert, a pale path wandering off across the stones, going somewhere, turning, coming back. You would walk right along the body of the hummingbird and never know you were inside a bird at all. That in the end is the riddle that has drawn people to this plain for the better part of a century, and it is the journey we will take together over the long hours of this night, slowly, in no hurry, stopping wherever the night invites us to rest. We will look closely at the technique, at exactly how a people without metal tools or written plans laid down lines so straight and figures so sure across a plain this large. We will walk among the figures themselves, the hummingbird and the monkey and the spider and the rest, and consider what is known and what is only guessed about why each one was made. We will follow the long straight lines out across the Pampa to wherever they laid, and ask what those who walked them were walking toward. We will go back to the rediscovery, to the early years of the last century, when travelers crossing the desert first began to notice that the ground beneath them was marked, and to the slow dawning, understanding that the marks could only truly be read from the air. We will spend a long, quiet while with Maria Reiche, the German-born mathematician who gave the better part of her life to these lines, who measured them and swept them clean with her own brooms and slept out on the Pampa to guard them year after year, until she came to be called the Lady of the Lines. We will think about water, which in a place this dry is the same thing as life, and about the deep possibility that the lines and the great cleared shapes had something to do with the search for it. We will look up, as the Nazca surely did, at the stars wheeling over this clear, dark desert sky, and weigh the old idea that the lines were a kind of map or calendar written on the ground to mirror the heavens. And through all of it, we will keep returning to the people themselves, not the spacemen and the riddles of the cheaper stories, but the actual living men and women of the Nazca, farmers and weavers and potters on a dry coast, who for reasons of their own went out onto this plain and moved the stones. But none of that is for now. For now there is only the plain and the last of the light, and the dark stones giving up their warmth to the coming night, and the pale ground waiting underneath everything, patient as it has been for 2,000 years. Let the names drift off if they want to. Nazca, the Pampa de San Jose, the Humboldt current, all of it, none of it is anything you need to carry down into sleep. They will keep. The lines themselves have kept through 20 centuries of silence, and a single night is nothing against that. Let the long-ruled avenues run away into the dark across the hills. Let the great pale figures lie open under the gathering stars, the hummingbird and the spider and the condor with its 100-meter wings, each one too large to see and in no need of being seen, simply lying there as it has always lain. The desert is utterly still now. The wind that almost never blows is not blowing. The rain that almost never falls is not going to fall tonight, nor most likely tomorrow, nor for a long while after. The cold current is running far out beyond the coast, holding the clouds down low over the sea where they can do no harm, and the high wall of the Andes stands dark against the last light in the east, holding back whatever weather might have come from there. Between them lies the plain, dry and even and immeasurably old, breathing its long, slow breath of warm stone cooling into the night. There is nothing here that asks anything of you. There never was. There is only the quiet plain and the pale lines lying open beneath the dark, and the enormous patient stillness of a place that has learned, better than anywhere else on earth, how to keep a thing exactly as it was given. Let the stars come out over the Pampa, one at a time at first, and then more the way they have come out over these lines for 2,000 years with no one to watch them. Let the dark stones cool. Let the pale ground rest. The journey ahead is long and gentle, and all of it will keep until you are ready. The technique, the figures, the long straight lines, the woman with her brooms, the water and the stars, and the people who move the stones. They have waited 20 centuries in the dry, still air. They can wait through the quiet hours of one night while you drift down slowly into sleep, held by the great calm of the driest, stillest plain there is. Sleep well. We can leave the wide view behind us now, the high, slow gaze from the window of a light aircraft, the long shapes turning beneath the wing of the great hummingbird, the spider, the spiral tail of the monkey, and come down out of the air entirely, down through the thin, bright sky, down to the surface of the desert itself, where the lines are not pictures anymore, but simply ground. Set the wonder of seeing them whole on a shelf for a little while, the way you set down a thing you have been carrying. Keep. Down here, kneeling in the warm gravel of the Nazca Plain, the great drawings are not mysterious at all. They are only the earth and a small change made to the earth, and the change is so simple that once you understand it, you may find it harder to believe than the mystery itself. There is nothing here that asks anything of you tonight. There is only the ground and a quiet old method and the long, slow work of hands that have been gone for 2,000 years. So look at the ground closely, the way you would look at the back of your own hand. The desert here is not soft and it is not sand, not the rolling dunes you might imagine when someone says the word desert. It is a hard, flat pan, a high tableland between the foothills of the Andes and the sea, and its surface is covered in small stones, a loose blanket of pebbles and gravel, perhaps 10 to 15 centimeters deep, lying over the firmer earth below, and those stones are dark. They are a deep reddish brown, almost the color of dried blood or old rust, and that color is not the stone itself but a coating upon it, a thin skin of iron oxide and clay that has been baking onto the surface of these pebbles for thousands upon thousands of years under the desert sun. Geologists call it desert varnish or rock varnish, a slow chemical staining that darkens exposed stone in dry places all over the world, given enough time and enough stillness. Here it has had all the time it could want. The whole plain wears that dark reddish skin, mile after mile of it, like the surface of some quiet old planet. And here is the secret of the entire thing, the whole answer, lying right there beneath the dark stones where it has always been. If you take those top pebbles away, if you simply pick them up and move them aside, the ground underneath is a different color. The earth beneath the dark gravel is pale, a soft yellow-gray, a light clayey subsoil that has been lying in shadow all this while, never touched by the sun, never stained by the slow varnish, holding its paleness in the dark the way a stone at the bottom of a riverbed stays smooth. So the surface of this desert is in effect two colors stacked one on top of the other, a dark lid and a pale floor beneath it, reddish-brown above, light yellow-gray below, and that is all you need. That is the whole canvas, and the whole palette, and the whole technique, waiting there in the ground for anyone patient enough to notice it. Because once you know that, you know how the lines were made. They were not painted on. Nothing was added to the desert at all, no pigment, no dye, no stone carried in from somewhere else, no carving down into bedrock. The method is the opposite of painting. It is the opposite of nearly everything we mean when we say someone made a picture. The makers did not put anything down, they took something away. They knelt on the dark plain and they lifted the reddish surface stones, hands gathering at a time, and they carried them a little way to the side, and they set them down along the edges in low banks, and where the dark stones had been, the pale earth showed through, bright against the dark all around it. A line scraped clean of its dark lid becomes a pale line, glowing faintly against the reddish ground, visible from a long way off. The Nazca did not draw on the desert, they undrew it. They removed the dark to let the light come up from underneath. The whole of it, every line, every spiral, every enormous animal, is made of absence. It is a picture made by taking away. There is a word the archaeologists use for this, and it is a good word to hold quietly as you drift. They call it a negative technique, a drawing made not by marking a surface but by removing one, and it changes how you should picture the work entirely. There were no brushes, there was no genius hand sweeping a great curve across the sand. There were only people, ordinary people, bent over in the sun, picking up stones and setting them aside, clearing a path of pale ground a few centimeters at a time, the dark pebbles heaping up in low ridges along the borders of whatever shape they were slowly uncovering. It is closer to weeding a garden than to painting a mural. It is closer to sweeping a floor. And the lines themselves, when you understand them this way, become very humble things. We imagine from the photographs deep dramatic channels gouged into the earth. They are nothing of the kind. The cleared furrows are shallow, only some 10 to 15 centimeters deep in most places, and rarely more than 30, no deeper than the dark gravel layer itself, because there was no reason to dig deeper than the pale earth, and every reason not to. You did not need a trench, you needed a color. You cleared down just far enough to reach the pale subsoil and no farther, and then you stopped. So if you walked one of these lines today, you would barely feel it underfoot. It is a faint, shallow scuff in the desert, a place where the dark stones have been brushed aside, ankle deep at the very most, and often far less. The straight lines run for great distances, some of them for kilometers, arrow straight across the plain, but in cross-section they are almost nothing, a shallow pale ribbon a hand's width to a few meters wide, scraped clean and edged with the dark stones that were lifted out of it. You could step across many of them without noticing. From the ground, standing among them, you might not see the picture at all. You would see only a pale path going off toward the horizon, and another crossing it, and the dark plain stretching away on every side. Let that smallness settle in you for a moment, because it is its own kind of marvel, quieter than the mystery, but truer. These figures that have filled people with such wonder, that have been called the work of gods and giants and visitors from the stars, are in physical fact among the most delicate marks ever made by human hands. A few centimeters deep, the weight of a coating of stones moved a short distance sideways. A child could undo a stretch of one of these lines in an afternoon, simply by kicking the dark gravel back into the pale channel. They have survived not because they were built strong, but because the desert that holds them is so perfectly, almost impossibly still. And consider, too, how little of that pale ground was ever needed to make a shape carry across great distance. A line a single hand's width wide, scraped clean and edged with its low dark banks, is enough to read from far off, because the contrast does the work that depth and breadth cannot. The eye does not need a wide channel. It needs only the difference between the dark and the light, and that difference is total, almost the difference between night and day, laid flat on the ground. For the makers spent their labor sparingly. They cleared no more than the picture asked for. A great straight line might be narrow as a footpath. A broad cleared shape, a so-called trapezoid, might open out wide as a runway and run for hundreds of meters, but even there the work was only the lifting of the surface stones, the same shallow scraping repeated across a larger floor. Whether narrow or wide, the lines are all the same simple act, scaled up or scaled down, the dark lid lifted, the pale beneath let through. Nothing more was ever required, and nothing more was ever done. And that stillness is worth understanding, because without it none of this would remain. The Nazca Plain is one of the driest places on the face of the earth. It lies in the long rain shadow between the Andes and the cold Pacific, and in some years it receives only minutes of rain, not days, not hours, but minutes, a brief faint mist that hardly wets the ground before the dry air drinks it back up again. There are no rivers running across the Pampa to carve it. There is almost no plant life to disturb it, no roots heaving the soil, no grass to grow over the cleared lines and hide them. And the wind, which you might expect to be the great enemy of so light a mark, is in fact remarkably gentle here, and the ground itself helps. The dark stones absorb the daytime heat and hold it, so that a warm cushion of air sits over the surface of the plain, a thin protective layer that softens the stronger winds before they can scour down to the pale earth below. So the lines, once cleared, simply stayed. Nothing came to erase them, nothing came to fill them in. The same shallow pale furrows that were swept clean 2,000 years ago are, for the most part, the very same furrows you can walk between today, held in place by nothing more than the great patience of a desert where almost nothing ever happens. They have lasted some 2,000 years not because they were carved deep, but because the world around them has scarcely moved. Now, knowing all of that, knowing how shallow the lines are, how simple the lifting of the stones, there is still one thing that seems at first genuinely hard. It is one thing to clear a pale path through dark gravel. It is another thing to clear a path that runs straight as a taut string for a kilometer or more across uneven ground, never wandering, never bending, holding its line over a distance where the far end is lost in the haze. How do you keep a line straight when you cannot see where it is going? And how, above all, do you draw a creature, a spider, a monkey, a bird with a beak longer than a city block, so large that no one standing on the ground could ever take in its shape and have it come out right? These are the questions that have launched 1,000 strange theories, and we will come to those theories gently in other hours of this night. But the plain answer, the answer the evidence keeps quietly pointing back toward, is that the methods were simple too, as simple as the lifting of the stones. For the straight lines, the makers seem to have used what surveyors have always used in every age and every land: stakes and cord. You drive a wooden post into the ground. You drive another a little way off in the direction you mean to go. You stretch a cord between them, or you simply sight along them by eye, lining up the two posts the way you line up the sights of anything you wish to aim. Then you walk that line, clearing the stones as you go, and before you reach the second post you set a third one beyond it, sighting carefully back along the line you have already made, and on, post by post, sighting always backward along the work already done, so that each new stretch carries the same straight direction forward. A line built this way can run for kilometers without bending, because at every step it is corrected against the steps behind it. There is no magic in it. There is only a stake, a length of cord, a careful eye, and a great deal of patience. And this is not merely a guess. The wooden posts have been found. At the ends of some of the long lines, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of wooden stakes still set in the ground where the makers left them. And when those stakes were tested, when a small piece was taken and dated by the slow clock of radiocarbon decay, the wood came back old enough to belong to the very people who made the lines. The markers are still there, in other words. The surveyors' posts that held the cords taut and gave the long lines their direction were never taken up. They have stood at the ends of the lines for 2,000 years, quietly confirming to anyone who thought to look exactly how the work was done. It is worth pausing on that because it is the kind of evidence that quietly closes a question. So much about the Nazca Lines is open and arguable, why they were made, what they meant, what the people who made them believed, but the how is not really open at all. It is anchored to physical things you could hold in your hand, the two stacked colors of the ground, the low banks of dark stones still heaped along the line edges where they were carried, the surveyor's stakes standing at the ends of the runs, the small scale drawings found nearby. These are not theories, they are leftovers, the ordinary debris of a job of work, lying where the workers left it. When you stand among them, the strangeness drains away and something plainer and warmer takes its place. The sense of a work site, abandoned at the end of the day, its tools still scattered about, as though the crew had only just walked off over the rise and might come back tomorrow to carry on. The great figures, the animals, the curving creatures, the shapes too large to see from the ground, there was a second simple idea, and a woman named Reiche, who spent the better part of her life lying out on this plain measuring and protecting these lines, was among the first to understand it clearly. Reiche noticed something near some of the figures, small drawings, little versions of the great shapes sketched out on a manageable scale, the size of a sheet or a tabletop rather than the size of a field. And she came to believe that this was the key, that the makers had not somehow drawn freehand at enormous size, which no one could do, but had worked the way a muralist works to this day. You make a small drawing first, a plan you can see all at once and hold in your two hands. Then you lay a grid over it, or you measure off its key points, and you scale those points up onto the ground, multiplying every distance by the same factor. So many paces here for so many fingers' breadth on the little plan, and you mark each scaled-up point with a stake, and you connect the stakes with cords stretched into curves, and you clear the stones along the cords. The giant on the ground is simply the small plan, made larger by careful multiplication. The bird with the beak longer than a street is just a sketch the size of your hand, scaled up a few hundred times, point by patient point. You never need to stand back and see the whole. You only need to be able to count and to keep your distances true. If that still sounds like more cleverness than ancient people are usually given credit for, then consider what happened in a field in Kentucky in the year 1982. A quiet, almost gentle experiment that did more to dissolve the mystery of the Nazca Lines than any amount of argument. A man named Joe Nickel, an investigator with a fondness for testing strange claims against plain reality, decided he would try to find out simply whether a person with no aircraft, no advanced instruments, and no help from the sky could reproduce one of the great Nazca figures. He chose the condor, the enormous Nazca vulture, a figure stretching some 440 feet across the desert, longer than a city block. He chose a flat field in Kentucky. And he gathered as his crew a small handful of his own relatives, not engineers, not surveyors, family on an ordinary weekend. Their tools were exactly the tools the Nazca would have had and nothing more. Wooden stakes, lengths of cord, some white lime to mark the cleared lines standing in for the pale earth of the Peruvian subsoil, a small drawing of the condor to work from. And the method was exactly the method we have been describing. They took the points of the small drawing and scaled them up, plotting where each one would fall on the great field, driving a stake at each plotted point and running the cord between them. In all, they staked out some 165 points and joined them with twine, the whole of the plotting and staking taking them around 9 hours of work. No one rose into the air to check it. No one looked down from above to correct a wandering curve. They simply trusted the method, the small plan, the scaled points, the stakes, the cords, and they followed it across the ground. And when it was finished, and when at last an aerial photograph was taken from above, there it was. The condor, the great Nazca bird, recreated in a Kentucky field with startling fidelity. Its wings and body and curved beak all in their right places, drawn by a man and a few of his relations, in a matter of days, with stakes and string and lime and patience, and not one thing more. No aircraft, no flying machine, no balloon, no view from the heavens. No technology the Nazca could not have held in their own two hands. The experiment did not prove exactly how the Nazca worked, only the desert itself can say that. But it proved the thing that needed proving, calmly and completely, that none of it required a miracle. Figures are within easy reach of ordinary people using the very simplest of tools. The mystery of how, at least, has a quiet and human answer, and it has had one for a long time now. So picture the labor then, as it most likely was not legions of slaves toiling under some impossible vision, not God stooping from the clouds, but a modest band of people on the warm, dry plain, going about a piece of work that was well within them. A handful of hands, perhaps a family, perhaps a few families, with a small drawing and a fistful of stakes and some coils of fiber cord. One person sighting along the posts, calling the line true. Others bent over the gravel, lifting the dark stones a double handful at a time, carrying them to the edge, building up the low border banks, working backward along the cleared pale path. A figure the size of a great animal could be uncovered in a matter of days by a group no larger than this, for there is nothing to dig and nothing to build, only stones to be lifted and moved a short way aside, the lightest of heavy work, repeated patiently under a sky that almost never changed. They could have done a little each day in the cool of the morning and walked home in the heat, and come back and finished within a week or two what would stand for 2,000 years. There is something tender in that picture when you let it settle, something that makes the great lines feel less like a riddle and more like a gift left behind by people not so unlike ourselves. They knelt where you might kneel. They lifted stones the way you might lift them with their hands, feeling the warmth the desert had put into them. They squinted along their cords and corrected their lines and stood up to ease their backs and looked out over the same pale plain. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it well, with a method so plain that a family in Kentucky could repeat it on a weekend 2,000 years later. The wonder of the Nazca Lines was never that they were impossible to make. The wonder, if anything, is the reverse, that something made so simply, so lightly, with stones lifted by hand and laid aside, should have outlasted nearly everything else those people built, should have outlasted their cities and their language and their names, and should be lying there still on the high dry plain, pale against the dark, exactly as they left it. Why they made them, that is another question entirely, and a deeper one, and we will go toward it slowly in the hours ahead, the way you go toward anything worth understanding. But the how of it you can set down now, finished and at rest, the dark stones lifted, the pale earth showing through, the stakes and the cords and the small drawings scaled up point by point across the ground. The gentle, rainless, windless patience of a desert that simply kept what was given to it. There is no machine in this story and no miracle. There is only the ground and the light beneath the dark and the quiet work of human hands. So let the plains stretch away from you now in the warm late light, pale lines on dark stone running off in every direction toward the soft brown hills. Let the makers finish their day and walk home, leaving their stakes standing at the ends of the lines. Let the desert grow still and stay still, hour after hour, year after year, century upon century, holding the shallow furrows in place with nothing but its own deep silence. There is nothing here that needs your attention. There is nothing to solve and nothing to fear. There is only a simple old method laid bare at last, and the long pale lines lying quietly under the dark sky, waiting as they have always waited with all the patience of the ground itself. 2 colors of earth and a cord and a stake and a small drawing held in 2 hands, and the time it takes to lift a few stones and carry them aside. That is all it ever was. And it was enough to leave a mark that has outlasted everything and asks nothing now, and will keep until morning and long, long after. We set down now the simple tools of the last hour, the bent stick, the length of cord, the patient hands that lifted the dark stones aside one by one, and stacked them along the edge to bear the pale ground beneath. All of that can rest where it lies, the technique laid back on its shelf like a thing well understood, for we know now how the lines were made, by clearing, not by carving, by taking away rather than adding, the desert floor itself becoming the drawing once its dark skin was peeled back to the lighter earth below. And with that knowing, we can turn from the long straight lines and the great open trapezoids and go looking instead for the figures, the animals and the plants, that lie scattered among them across the Pampa, each one a single shape pressed into the desert, waiting, as it has waited for something like 2,000 years, in perfect stillness under the high, dry sky. There is nothing here that asks anything of you tonight. We are only going to walk slowly from one figure to the next, the way you might wander a vast and silent gallery where the pictures lie flat upon the floor and are too large to take in all at once. Let the names and the numbers come and go as they please. You do not have to hold them. They will hold themselves. Begin with the count because the count is worth knowing. Among the many hundreds of straight lines and geometric shapes etched across the Nazca plain, there is a smaller and stranger family of designs, the figures the scholars call biomorphs, which is only a careful word meaning shapes of living things. For most of the last century, the number of these recognized figures hovered somewhere around 70 living forms drawn into the desert, animals and birds and plants, and a few shapes harder to name. 70 is not a large number, set against the hundreds of lines, and that is part of what makes the figures so precious. They are the rare ones. They are the pictures among all the geometry, and they are the ones that have drawn the eyes and the wonder of everyone who has ever flown over this place. And here is the thing about them, the single fact that once you see it, you cannot unsee, the fact that turns these figures from mere drawings into something closer to riddles. Almost every one of them is made from one continuous line. A single unbroken stroke that begins at some point along the figure's body, travels all the way around and through it, out along a wing, down the length of a tail, around the curve of a beak, back along a leg, and never once crosses over itself, never lifts, never doubles back upon a path it has already drawn, until at last it returns to a point very near where it began. One line, one stroke. A drawing made the way a child might try to draw a house without lifting the pencil from the paper, except that here the pencil is a person walking, and the paper is the floor of a desert, and the house is a hummingbird 93 meters long. Hold that for a moment, because it is the quiet center of everything we will look at tonight. If a figure is a single unbroken line that never crosses itself, then a figure is also a path. It can be walked. You could set your foot at the starting point and follow the cleared channel of pale earth all the way around the whole great shape, out along the wing, down the tail, around the beak, and arrive back eventually, near where you set out, having traced the entire animal with your own 2 feet without ever having to step over a line you had already passed. This is not a small observation. It is the seed of one of the gentlest and most persuasive ideas anyone has offered about why these figures were made at all. Not perhaps to be seen from above, for no one in the ancient world could rise high enough to see them whole, but to be walked. To be processed along slowly in some rite whose shape and meaning are mostly lost to us, a line of people moving in single file around the body of a sacred animal, following the path the line laid down for them, footstep after footstep, until the whole shape had been traveled and the rite was complete. We will come back to that idea before the hour is out. For now, only carry it. Each figure is a path, and a path is for walking. So let us walk the first of them, the hummingbird, since we have named it already. It is one of the most beloved of all the figures, and it is not large by the standards of this place, somewhere between 93 and 96 meters from the tip of its long straight beak to the end of its splayed tail, which is to say the length of a soccer pitch, give or take. Picture it. The body slender and tapering, the wings swept back and outward as if caught in the very middle of that blurred hovering hum that gives the bird its name, and the tail opening behind it in a clean wedge of straight lines like the spread of a fan. The beak is the strange and telling part, far longer than any real hummingbird's, a single narrow channel running straight out ahead of the body for many meters, ending in nothing, pointing across the desert towards some horizon we can no longer read. And the whole of it, beak and body and outstretched wings and fanning tail, is that one unbroken line, cleared into the pale earth, returning to itself. You could walk a hummingbird. People may once have done exactly that. Drift on then to the condor. If the hummingbird is delicate, the condor is vast, one of the largest of the bird figures, somewhere between 130 and 136 meters from beak to tail and wingtip to wingtip. A great spread bird with its wings flung wide and its neck stretched out, and its long-fingered feathers reaching toward the edges of its enormous frame. The Andean condor is a real bird, the largest flying bird in the Western world, a creature with a wingspan of 3 meters that the peoples of the Andes have held sacred for thousands of years. A bird that climbs the thermals over the high mountains and seems from below to touch the roof of the sky. To find it here, drawn enormous in the desert, wings open as if riding an updraft you cannot see, is to understand that whoever made these figures was not drawing at random. They were drawing the things that mattered to them, the things they revered, the things they ate, the things they feared, the things they may have prayed to. The condor was one of those. It is laid into the ground here in a single line longer than a city block. Now the monkey, and the monkey is one of the strangest of all because the monkey does not belong here. There are no monkeys in the coastal desert of southern Peru, none anywhere near it. Monkeys live far to the east, over the wall of the Andes, down in the green steam of the Amazon basin. And yet here, drawn 93 meters across the bone-dry Pampa, is unmistakably a monkey, a creature with a long curling tail that spirals around itself in a great tight coil, that famous spiral, like a watch spring or the inside of a shell. To have drawn it, the people of Nazca must have known the monkey, must have traveled to the rainforest, or traded with those who lived there, or carried the memory of it across the mountains in story and in painted clay, and then chosen to set that distant jungle creature down in the middle of their own waterless world. And there is one more detail, the one everyone remembers once they have heard it. The monkey has the wrong number of fingers. On one hand it has 4, on the other 5. 9 fingers in all where there should be 10. No one knows whether this was a mistake, an error in the laying out of so vast a figure, easy enough to make when you cannot see the whole of what you are drawing, or whether it meant something, whether the 9-fingered hand was deliberate, a sign or a count or a sacred imperfection. The monkey keeps that to itself, as it keeps the spiral of its tail wound tight and silent in the dust. Let your breathing slow, and we will come to the spider, which is smaller and closer and somehow more intimate than the great birds. The spider is only about 46 meters across, modest for this place, but it is one of the most precise and beautiful of all the figures, the 8 legs reaching out in careful order from the round body, every joint articulated, the whole thing rendered with a delicacy that seems impossible at such a scale on ground you cannot stand above. And here the spider offers up a small puzzle that has fascinated those who study it. Look closely at the figure, at the way one of its legs extends and thickens at the tip, and it appears to depict not just any spider, but a very particular and very rare kind. Some who have studied it have argued that the Nazca spider belongs to an order called Reiche, a small and obscure group of arachnids, hooded tick spiders, that are found almost nowhere in the world, and certainly not in this desert. They live, like the monkey, in the deep rainforest, and one feature of the figure, a slender, extended leg that in the real animal is the organ by which the male transfers its seed, is so small and so specialized that to have drawn it accurately you would have needed to examine the living creature very closely indeed, perhaps under some kind of magnification we do not understand, or perhaps simply with patient eyes and a memory carried back across the mountains. Whether the Nazca spider truly is a Reiche, or whether that reading asks too much of a figure scraped into gravel, is argued still. But the puzzle is a real one, and it sits there in the desert, 8-legged and exact, waiting on an answer. There is a craft to that precision worth pausing over before we move on. To draw a creature 46 meters across, or a bird 93 meters long, in a single line that never crosses itself and yet comes out as a recognizable spider, a recognizable hummingbird, that is not a thing you do by walking out into the desert and trusting your eye. The eye cannot help you. You cannot stand far enough back to see what you're making. The most widely accepted explanation is the simplest one, and it asks for nothing but cord and stakes and patience. The makers, scholars believe, first drew the figure small, on a scrap of cloth perhaps, or scratched into the ground at a size a person could take in whole, and then enlarged it onto the desert floor by a kind of grid-end measure scaling, planting a stake, running a cord to fix a distance and a direction, marking the next point and the next, building the great line out of many small, careful, straight segments and gentle arcs that the eye, from above, reads as one flowing curve. It is the same method in spirit that lets a muralist transfer a tiny sketch onto a wall 4 stories high. No magic in it and no need of any, only string and a plan, and the willingness to work for days on a shape you would never, in your whole life, see complete. We have walked among the famous ones now, and you may let them blur together a little, the hovering bird, the spread condor, the spiraling monkey, the precise spider, for there are many more, and we are in no hurry to name them all. There is a figure most people call the pelican, though some have called it a heron or a flamingo, or by older names still, an enormous wading bird whose neck zigzags back and forth in great folds, and which may be the largest figure of them all, by some measures 280, even 300 meters in length, a single bird drawn nearly a third of a kilometer across the desert. So large that from the ground you could stand in the middle of it and never guess you were standing inside a drawing at all. There is a whale, or an orca, a killer whale laid into the earth far from any sea, its body rounded and its tail flaring, a creature of the deep cold Pacific drawn in the heart of one of the driest places on earth. There is a dog, lame and long-legged. There is a tree, its branches reaching up and out. There are hands, actual hands, fingers spread. There is a flower. There are shapes that resist all naming, that are simply themselves, lines that close into forms we have no word for. 70 of them more or less, scattered across the Pampa, each one alone in its patch of desert, each one a single walked line, each one facing the sky. There is one more we should pause on before we leave the great figures, because it has gathered more wild talk around it than all the others together, and it does us good to look at it plainly and set the wildness gently aside. Upon the slope of a low hill, rather than out on the flat plain, there stands a figure perhaps 30 meters tall, carved into the hillside, a standing form with a great round head and two enormous round eyes and one hand lifted, as though in greeting or in some signal across the centuries. Because of that round staring face and that raised hand, some have taken to calling it the astronaut, and have built upon it whole towers of story about visitors come down from the stars. But there is no need for any of that. The figure is most often called the Owl Man now, and its round-eyed face is very like the owl-eyed beings the Nazca painted onto their own pottery and wove into their own cloth, a creature of their own imagining, an owl perhaps, or a watchful spirit, or a shaman in some remembered guise, a thing entirely of this world in these people's hands. It greets us from its hillside with its lifted hand, an old and human image, and we may greet it back and pass on and trouble ourselves with nothing stranger than that. And here is the fact that anchors all of it, that takes these figures out of the realm of mystery and ties them firmly to a people and a time. We are not guessing when we say who made them. The style of these drawings, the way the bird's tail fans, the way the line turns, the particular shapes of the creatures and the way they are rendered, matches, closely and unmistakably, the art that the Nazca people painted onto their pottery and wove into their cloth. The Nazca culture, which flourished on this coast from roughly 200 years before the Common Era to around 600 years after it, left behind a great wealth of polychrome pottery, vessels painted in many colors with exactly these motifs. The hummingbird, the killer whale, the spider, the strange composite creatures, the spread-winged birds, the round-eyed owl beings. And they wove textiles, fine and intricate, carrying the same images in thread. When you set a Nazca painted vase beside a photograph of one of the geoglyphs, the kinship leaps out at you. The same hand, the same eye, the same vocabulary of sacred animals, once made small enough to hold in your two hands and turn in the light, once made so large you could walk inside it. This is how we know. Not from legend, not from speculation, but from the plain matching of one art to another, the figures on the ground speaking the same visual language as the figures on the pots. The people who drew the desert were the people who painted the clay. There is a deep and grounding comfort in that for all the mystery of why, the question of who has a real and solid answer. Rest there a while in that solidity before we drift toward the newer and stranger discoveries, because the story of the figures did not end when the last of the famous ones was charted in the middle of the last century. It is still going on. It is going on right now. In the year 2020, while much of the world had gone quiet and still, researchers working on the Pampa to improve the path to a visitor lookout came upon a figure no one had recorded before. A cat, a great lounging feline some 37 meters long, stretched across a steep hillside, its body in profile, its head turned to face outward, its tail curled, its ears pricked up in two neat triangles. It had been there the whole time, of course. It had been there for around 2,000 years, but it lay on a slope so steep, and its lines had so nearly faded back into the desert that it had simply gone unseen generation after generation, until the right eyes passed over it at the right hour of the right day. The experts who studied it believe the cat is older even than most of the figures around it, dating to the Paracas culture that came before the Nazca, perhaps 100 or 200 years before the Common Era, which would make it among the oldest of all the figures on the plain, an ancestor among them, a cat that was already old when the hummingbird was new. There is something wonderful in that a thing so large could hide so long in plain sight and then simply appear, as if the desert had decided, after 2,000 years, that it was finally ready to be seen. And the cat was only the beginning of the new finding. For some years now, a team from Yamagata University in Japan, led by an archaeologist named Masato Sakai, has been studying the Pampa with patient and modern eyes, flying drones low over the desert, photographing every meter of it, and then in time, teaching an artificial intelligence to do what human eyes find so slow and so difficult, to pick out the faint, half-erased traces of figures from the endless field of gray gravel. The desert is enormous, and the figures, many of them, are small and badly weathered, scraped shallow and nearly healed over by 2 millennia of wind. To find them by eye, walking and flying and squinting, took the better part of a century to reach that count of around 70 great figures and a few hundred lines and shapes besides. But with the artificial intelligence trained to flag the faint candidates, and human experts then going out to confirm them on the ground, the pace changed entirely. In a single survey season, working perhaps 20 times faster than the old methods allowed, the team identified hundreds of new figures, small ones mostly, scraped onto the slopes beside the ancient footpaths, depicting human figures and severed heads and domesticated animals, llamas and dogs and birds, scenes of daily and ritual life laid out where a person walking the old paths would come upon them one by one. By their reckoning, the discoveries nearly doubled the number of known figurative geoglyphs, taking account of these living-shaped drawings from a few hundred towards something approaching 1,000. The desert, it turns out, is far more crowded than anyone knew. It is covered in pictures, most of them too faint and too small for the eye to have ever caught, a whole gallery hidden in the gravel, only now beginning to be read. And the new figures did more than add to the count. They began gently to answer the question of why. For the small figures, the ones the survey found in their hundreds, cluster along the old winding footpaths that thread across the Pampa, set close to the trails where a traveler on foot would pass right beside them and look down and see, at human scale, a single clear image, a llama, a bird, a person. These, the researchers suggest, may have been made to be seen up close, by individuals walking the paths, perhaps as markers, perhaps as small acts of devotion left along the way. The great figures, the hummingbird, the condor, the spider, the ones too large to take in from the ground, sit apart from the trails, along the broad straight lines, and those, the thinking goes, may indeed have been the ones meant for walking, meant for procession, for groups of people to move along together in rite and ceremony, tracing the single unbroken line of the sacred animal with their feet. Two kinds of figure for two kinds of scene. One for the lone traveler's glance, one for the slow communal walk. It is the gentlest of conclusions, drawn not from speculation, but from where the figures actually lie upon the ground, and it brings us right back around to the single line, the unbroken path, the foot that could follow the whole shape of a creature and return to where it began. So let the figures lie there now, all of them in the great silence of the Pampa under the high cold stars, the hummingbird with its long pointing beak, the condor with its wings flung wide, the spiraling monkey with its 9 quiet fingers, the precise and patient spider, the vast zigzagging pelican, the whale stranded 100 kilometers from any sea, the dog, the tree, the spread hands, the owl man greeting the centuries from his hillside, the lounging cat that waited 2,000 years to be seen. And the hundreds of small new figures scattered along the old footpaths, only now stepping out of the gravel into the light. Each one a single line, each one a path, each one drawn by a people we can name, in a style we can match to the pots they painted and the cloth they wove, for reasons we're still slowly, patiently beginning to understand. There is no need to settle any of it tonight. The figures have kept their patience for 20 centuries, lying open to the sky, and they will keep it a while longer. They are in no hurry at all. Let your own breathing settle into that same long patience now, slow and even as the wind that has been smoothing these lines for 2,000 years. There is nothing on the Pampa that needs you to wait for it. The hummingbird hovers where it has always hovered. The spider holds its careful 8-legged stillness. The great line of the condor's wing runs on into the dark, out toward a horizon that no longer changes. And somewhere among them in the next quiet hour lies the question of who was ever meant to look up and see all of this, and from how high, which is a question for later, for a time when you may already be far down towards sleep. For now there is only the figures and the silence and the wide dark desert holding its drawings up to the stars, the way it has held them, faithfully and without complaint, since long before anyone now living was born. Let the single lines loop gently out and gently home, and let your thoughts follow them down softly, with nothing to hold and nothing to keep, down and quietly down towards sleep. We let the great drawings go now, gently the way you set down a book you have been reading by lamplight, the hummingbird with its long beak laid out across the slope, the spider with its single odd leg, the monkey with the spiral tail, the strange standing figure on the hillside with one hand raised. All of those shapes can rest where they lie in the dark of the desert, patient as they have always been, and we will not need to carry them with us. Because there is something else out here on the Pampa, something far more common than the animals and the plants, something that covers far more of this ground than any creature ever drawn, and it is in its own quiet way the deeper wonder of this place, not the pictures at all, the lines themselves, the long, straight, plain lines that run out across the desert in every direction, mile after mile, with a patience and a precision that is harder to explain than any hummingbird. So come back to the surface of the Pampa, the high flat tableland between the rivers, where the air is dry and still and the night has come down cool and clear. The figures are the famous thing, the thing that draws the eye and fills the photographs. But if you could lift up above this desert and look down at the whole of it, you would see that the animals are almost an afterthought, a scattering of perhaps 70 or so drawings, lovely and strange, tucked here and there among something far vaster. You would see lines. Hundreds upon hundreds of lines. They cross the plain in every direction, some short, some impossibly long, laid down so thickly in places that the desert looks scored and scratched all over, like a great pale slate that countless hands have ruled and ruled again. There is nothing to fear in any of it. It is only marks upon the ground made by people very long ago, waiting in the dark for the morning that always comes. Let us put some numbers to it softly, because the numbers are part of the wonder. Beyond the roughly 70 figures of animals and plants, the Pampa holds well over 800 straight lines. It holds something like 300 geometric shapes, triangles and rectangles and spirals and zigzags, and above all, the great cleared trapezoids we will come to in a while. And if you were to add up the length of all the lines, every straight scratch and avenue and ray laid across this desert, the total would come to something staggering. Estimates run well over 1,300 kilometers of lines. More than 800 miles of deliberate marks drawn across an area of roughly 450 square kilometers of dry tableland. That is the true scale of the thing, not a gallery of pictures. A vast, sprawling, scribbled-over country of lines, with the famous animals sitting among them like a few signatures in the corner of an enormous and crowded page. You can let that settle for a moment. 800 lines, 300 shapes, 1,300 kilometers, all of it scratched into the surface of one of the driest deserts on Earth by a people who had no metal tools to speak of, no written language that we have ever found, no wheel, no horses, no way to rise up and look down at what they were making. They worked on the ground in the sun by hand with stakes and cords and the simplest of methods, and they made this. The pictures are charming. But the lines are the astonishment, and the longer you look at them, the larger the astonishment grows. Picture one of them now, just one, as it would lie before you in the early light. You are standing at one end of a line. It begins beneath your feet, a shallow path, perhaps a hand's depth, perhaps less, cleared of the dark, iron-stained, sun-blackened stones that cover the desert floor, so that the pale yellow earth beneath shows through in a band of lighter color. That is all a line is in the end, a removal. The desert here is paved naturally with a layer of dark pebbles, and beneath them lies lighter ground, and to make a line you have only to lift the dark stones aside and pile them along the edges and let the pale earth show. Simple, and yet the line that begins beneath your feet runs away from you toward the horizon, straight as a stretched thread, and it does not stop at the horizon. It goes over it. It goes down into a shallow valley and up the far side and over the next rise and keeps going. And if you walked it, and people have walked these, mile after patient mile, you would find that it ran on for a kilometer, and then another, and another. Some of these single straight lines run for many kilometers without ever bending. Some go on for over 30 kilometers. The longest of them reach something close to 48 kilometers, nearly 30 miles, a single straight line drawn across the desert, longer than many a city is wide, holding its bearing the entire way. And here is the thing that is genuinely hard to understand, the thing that no amount of staring quite resolves. Over all that distance, the line stays arrow straight. It does not wander, it does not drift off true and then correct itself. The makers were able to hold a heading across kilometers of uneven, broken, rising and falling ground, deviating only a few meters over the span of a full kilometer, a few meters in 1,000. That is a precision that would be difficult to achieve today with modern instruments and a clear line of sight, and these people achieved it again and again, hundreds of times, walking the ground, over terrain that hid the far end of the line behind every rise. That is the real mystery of the Pampa, if there is one, not what the lines mean, which we may never settle, but simply how they were drawn so straight, so long, so often. Hold that question gently. We will come back to it before the chapter is done, because the answer, as far as anyone has found one, is wonderfully humble. It helps, as you lie there, to understand just how varied these straight marks are, for not all lines are alike. Some are barely more than a hand's breadth across, a narrow cleared path you could straddle with 2 feet. Others are broad as a country lane, or broader, wide enough that several people might walk them side by side. Some are short, a few dozen meters and done. Others, as we said, run for many kilometers without a single bend. And they cross one another endlessly, the older marks cut through by the newer, line laid over line, until in places the desert floor is a great pale tangle of overlapping paths. a record written and overwritten across more than 1,000 years of patient returning. No single architect drew this in a single season. It grew mark by mark, generation by generation, as the people came back to the Pampa again and again to clear a new line, to refresh an old one, to add their own thread to the enormous loom of threads already lying there. When you understand that the sheer abundance of the line stops being a puzzle and becomes something gentler, the accumulated handiwork of many lifetimes, the way a long-walked path through a meadow is the accumulated handiwork of many feet. And consider, as the count keeps climbing, what such abundance asked of the people who made it. 800 lines and 300 shapes do not appear by accident, and they do not appear quickly. Each one had to be planned, sighted, and cleared by hand, every dark stone lifted and carried to the margin, every meter of pale earth uncovered, every long heading held true across the rises. To produce more than 1,300 kilometers of cleared line across 450 square kilometers of desert is the labor of a society organized to do it, returning across many generations, treating the making itself as something worth doing again and again. That, more than the size of any single figure, is the measure of how much these marks matter to the people who left them. You do not spend that much of your collective life upon something idle. Whatever the lines were for, they were not a passing whim. They were, for the people of this desert, among the most important things they did, and they kept at it by the best reckoning for something like 1,000 years, beginning a few centuries before the time of Christ and continuing for centuries after, a span longer than the whole history of many a nation, the marks accumulating quietly across all that time beneath an almost rainless sky. But first, the trapezoids, for they are the other great feature of this place, and the most arresting of all when you stand among them. Scattered across the Pampa, often where the land is widest and flattest, there are great cleared shapes, vast open figures swept entirely clean of their dark stones, so that they lie like pale lakes of bare earth in the middle of the dark desert floor. The most common of these is the trapezoid, a long four-sided figure, narrow at one end and wide at the other, like a road that opens out as it goes, or a wedge driven into the plain. Some of them are enormous. They run for hundreds of meters in length. The largest cover an area you could measure in the tens of thousands, even the hundreds of thousands, of square meters, broad open plazas of cleared ground, big enough to hold a crowd, big enough to land a small aircraft on, were it not for one inconvenient fact we will come to in a moment. Stand in the middle of one of these trapezoids in the first light of morning, and you feel the strangeness of it in your body. The ground beneath you is swept bare and pale and perfectly flat, and it stretches away on either side in long converging lines that draw your eye toward the wide end, or the narrow one, the way the walls of a great hall draw your eye toward the far door. The edges are clean. The dark stones are piled neatly along them, low ridges marking the borders, so that the cleared space inside reads as deliberately, almost severely made. There is a feeling of having entered something, a room without a roof, a plaza without a city, a road that goes from nowhere in particular to nowhere in particular, and yet has clearly been made with enormous care. The triangles do the same thing, the great cleared triangular figures, narrowing to a point at one end and opening wide at the other, swept just as clean. It is natural standing there to think of runways. From the air, photographed in the high clear light, the long pale trapezoids look uncannily like the cleared strips where aircraft land. And in the middle of the last century, when these images first reached a wide audience, that resemblance launched 1,000 strange ideas, that the trapezoids were landing fields, that something or someone had needed a place to come down out of the sky. It is worth laying that idea quietly to rest here on the ground, because the ground itself refuses it. The Pampa is not a hard surface, it is soft. Beneath the thin layer of dark stones lies fine, loose, dusty earth, the kind of ground that gives way underfoot, that holds a footprint, that has held the footprints and the swept stones of the people who made these lines for more than 1,500 years precisely, because it is so soft and so still, and so rarely disturbed by rain or wind. A heavy machine landing on that surface would not skim along it. It would sink into it, plow it, tear it open. Nothing has ever landed on these trapezoids because nothing heavy could. They were swept clean and walked upon by people on foot, and the very softness that makes them useless as runways is the same softness that has preserved them, almost untouched, across all the long centuries since. So what were they, the trapezoids, the triangles, the 800 lines? Here we reach the work of the people who have spent their lives walking this desert and measuring it, and their findings are quieter and more interesting than any tale of visitors from the sky. In the 1970s and the years that followed, an American astronomer named Anthony Aveni, together with the archaeologist Persis Clarkson and others, set out to do something that sounds obvious but had hardly been done before. Not to photograph the lines from above and guess at them, but to walk them on the ground end to end and map where each one began and where it went. Persis Clarkson walked hundreds of miles of the Pampa, patiently line by line, in the heat and the dust. Aveni mapped the network of them, and what they found, by attending to the ground rather than the air, was a pattern that the famous photographs had hidden. The lines, it turned out, were not scattered at random across the desert. They gathered, they converged. Again and again, the long straight lines were found to run inward towards certain points, and at those points, dozens of lines met, radiating outward from a single hub like spokes from the center of a wheel or like rays from a sun. Aveni gave these hubs a name, ray centers, or in Spanish, centros radials. He and his colleagues identified roughly 62 of them across the Pampa. And nearly every straight line on the desert, when you traced it patiently to its end, was found to connect to one of these centers. Just about every line, Aveni said, connects to a ray center. The desert was not a chaos of marks after all. It was a network, a web of hubs and the lines that ran between them, the lines reaching out from one center and arriving at another, knitting the whole vast tableland together into a single connected design. And the centers themselves were not placed at random either. They tended to sit on small natural rises, low hills and mounds and the ends of ridges, the slightly higher ground from which a person could see out across the plain. More than that, they tended to cluster where water came down from the highlands, where the rivers and seasonal streams ran out of the mountains and spread into the dry valley below. The ray centers gathered near the water. And the great trapezoids so often were found nearby, and more often than not, when Aveni and his colleagues measured them, the long axis of a trapezoid ran parallel to the flow of the water, pointing the way the streams ran, as though the cleared shapes were somehow keyed to the movement of water across this thirsty land. In a desert where water is everything, where a people lived or died by the meltwater coming down from distant peaks, the lines and the centers and the broad cleared figures all seem to lane, quietly, toward the water, to mark it, to honor it, perhaps to walk toward it in some procession we can no longer see. Walking, in fact, is the word that keeps returning. Stand again in one of the trapezoids or at one of the ray centers with its dozens of lines fanning out across the plain, and the impression is overwhelmingly of paths, of routes meant to be walked. The lines are not the kind of thing you look at from a single vantage and take in all at once. You cannot, not from the ground, where they vanish over the rises. They are the kind of thing you move along. A line is a way of going somewhere in a perfectly straight direction, and a ray center is a place where many such ways come together, and a trapezoid is a wide cleared space you might gather in or process across or sweep clean as an act of devotion in itself. Some who have studied the Pampa believe the very making and maintaining of the lines, the sweeping, the clearing, the walking of them was the point, a ritual repeated across generations, the act mattering more than any picture it left behind. And here the desert opens out onto something larger than itself, a thread that runs deep into the heart of the Andes. Because the people of Nazca were not the only ones in this part of the world who drew sacred straight lines and walked them. Many centuries later, long after the Nazca culture had faded, the Inca built their great empire from the city of Cusco, high in the southern mountains, and at the very center of Cusco, at the temple they called the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, there began a system of lines that the Inca called the Sec system. From that one sacred center, lines radiated outward across the land in every direction, by most accounts something like 41 of them, running out toward the horizon in relatively straight paths and strung along each line like beads upon a thread, were the shrines and sacred places, the springs and stones and hills that the Inca held holy. The Sec lines organized the whole sacred landscape around Cusco. They were walked in procession. They were tended by particular families and groups. They were aligned, some of them, to the rising and setting of stars, to the turning of the seasons, to the calendar of ceremonies that ordered the year. They were, in short, a network of sacred straight lines radiating from a center, which is, you will have noticed, very nearly a description of what Aveni and Clarkson found on the Pampa of Nazca 1,000 years before. You can hold those two pictures side by side gently as you drift. The ray centers of Nazca, 62 hubs with their lines fanning out across the desert made before the time of Christ, and the Sec lines of Cusco, radiating from the Temple of the Sun, walked by the Inca more than 1,000 years afterward. They are separated by a vast gulf of time and by hundreds of miles of mountain and coast, and no one can draw a single unbroken line of descent from one to the other. And yet the resemblance is striking enough that many who have studied them believe we are looking at two expressions of the same very old idea, a deep Andean tradition of the sacred straight line, of organizing the world by drawing paths outward from holy centers and walking them, an instinct that ran through these mountains and deserts for thousands of years, surfacing here in the lines of the Pampa and there in the sects of Cusco, like the same melody played by two musicians who never met. The Nazca Lines in that light are not an isolated marvel at all. They are one of the oldest surviving chapters of a story the whole region was telling, in its bones, for a very long time. Brings us at the last back to the question we set down a while ago, the one that is harder to answer than any question of meaning. Not why the lines were made, but how they were made so straight, so long across ground that hid their own ends. And the answer that the patient walkers of the Pampa have pieced together is, as promised, wonderfully humble. There is no need for anything from the sky, no need for instruments we have lost, no need for any knowledge the people of Nazca did not plainly have. There is need only for stakes and cord and patience, and a few people willing to walk. Imagine it, you wish to draw a line perfectly straight for a great distance. You set a stake in the ground where the line is to begin. You set a second stake a little way off in the direction you mean to go. Now you have a heading, a bearing fixed by 2 points, the way a sailor fixes a course by lining up 2 marks. You walk forward along that heading, and at some distance you set a third stake, sighting carefully back along the first 2 so that all 3 stand in a perfect row. Then you go on, sighting back along the last 2 stakes each time you set a new one, keeping them always in a line. Stake by stake, sighting always backward to keep yourself true, you can carry a heading across a kilometer, and then across many kilometers, deviating only a few meters in all that distance, exactly the precision we find in the lines. Researchers have tested this. With nothing but wooden stakes and lengths of cord, working on the ground, small teams have laid out long lines on the desert as straight as the ancient ones. Remains of just such wooden stakes have been found at the ends of some of the real lines, set in the earth where the makers left them. And the dating of that old wood is part of how we know when the lines were made at all. So the great precision, the thing that seems for a moment to demand some impossible explanation, dissolves quietly into something deeply human and deeply ordinary. People on foot in the sun, sighting along a row of stakes, clearing the dark stones aside one by one, walking their lines true across the empty desert because they had decided that it mattered, and because they had the patience to do it right. There is something restful in that, in the way the largest mystery comes down at last to the smallest and steadiest of human acts. A stake, a cord, a backward glance to keep the heading true, and then a step and another across the pale and patient ground. Let the lines lie where they are now, all 800 of them and more, all 1,300 kilometers, fanning out from their 62 quiet centers in the dark, holding their headings as straight and true as they have held them for 1,500 years and more. There is nothing out there in the desert that asks anything of you tonight. There is only the cool, still air over the Pampa, and the pale earth showing faintly beneath the stars, and the long lines running away to every horizon, patient, unhurried, going where the old walkers sent them and waiting, as they have always waited, for a morning that is in no hurry to come. Let the wide quiet of that desert hold you the way it holds the lines, gently, evenly, asking nothing, and drift on down towards sleep, along whatever straight and easy path the night has cleared for you. We set down now the long straight lines and the wide pale shapes, the trapezoids that run like roadways toward the far edge of the plain, the triangles pointing across the dust, the great cleared courtyards swept open and waiting. They can rest where they lie, mile upon mile of them, written across the desert in their quiet thousands, exactly as they have rested for the better part of 2,000 years. We have stood among them on the ground, you and I, where the makers stood, and felt how line runs away true and unwavering until it thins into the shimmer of distance. And now we are going to do something the makers themselves, as far as we know, never once did. We are going to leave the ground. We are going to rise up into the air above the Pampa and look down, and we are going to follow the slow, almost accidental story of how the rest of the world learned to do the same. But first, a thing worth holding clearly, because it is the heart of this whole chapter, and it will keep the rest of it gentle. The lines were never truly lost. That is the quiet truth at the center of the rediscovery, and it is worth saying plainly before we go any further, so that you can let go of the more dramatic version of the story, the one where a great secret slept undisturbed in the desert for 2,000 years, until an airplane stumbled upon it by chance. That is not what happened. The people who lived on this coast never stopped knowing the lines were there. Farmers walked across them on their way between fields. Herders crossed them with their animals. The lines were part of the landscape, as ordinary and as present as the dry hills and the river valleys, and the people of the Nazca Valley had no need to be told about a thing they had grown up walking over. The lines were hiding in plain sight, which is a very different thing from being lost. They were simply too large and too low and too pale for anyone standing among them to see them whole. And some of them, it turns out, were noticed and written down a very long time ago, long before any aircraft, long before anyone thought of them as a mystery at all. The earliest written mention we have comes from a Spanish soldier and chronicler named Pedro Cieza de León, who traveled through Peru in the years just after the conquest, in the middle of the 1500s, and who set down in his great chronicle of the country the things he saw. He was a careful observer, Cieza de León. He wrote about the Inca roads, the cities, the customs of the people, the lay of the land, and somewhere in the dry country of the south he noticed strange markings on the ground, lines and signs cut into the surface of the desert, and he wrote that they served as markers, as señals, signs by which travelers found their way. He did not know what they were. He did not call them anything grand. He simply noted in the manner of a man cataloging a country that there were marks upon the ground there, and that they seemed to guide the path. His chronicle was set down around the year 1547 and reached print a few years later, in the 1550s, which means the lines first entered the written record of the world more than 4 centuries ago, in the plainest and most matter-of-fact way imaginable, as roadside markings noticed in passing by a soldier crossing a desert. There is no mystery in his telling. There is only a man on a long journey looking down and writing what he saw. So the lines were known, they were walked upon and written about and lived among for centuries. What had not yet happened, what could not yet happen, was for anyone to see them whole, to take in their full scale and pattern all at once, the way you would take in a drawing laid flat upon a table. And the reason is simply the reason we have already found together, standing down among them. From the ground, you cannot. The lines are too long and too low. You can see a stretch of cleared earth running away from your feet, and you can follow it with your eye until it thins out of seeing, but you cannot see the shape it makes, because the shape may be a mile wide and you are a person 5 or 6 feet tall standing in the middle of it. To see a drawing, you must stand back from it, and there was no standing back from these. The only place to stand back was up. For most of human history, there was no up. There was the top of a hill, which helps a little, and the makers used the hills, and some of the figures can be glimpsed from the higher ground at the desert's edge. But the true rising, the lifting of a person clear off the earth to look straight down upon it, did not become possible until our own age, until the coming of the aeroplane. And so for 2,000 years the lines lay upon the desert in their full vast pattern, complete, finished, waiting, not for someone to discover them, for they were never hidden, but simply for someone to find the one vantage from which their wholeness could be seen. That vantage was the sky, and the sky did not open to ordinary people until well into the 20th century. Before the sky, though, there was the ground, and it is on the ground that the real study of the lines begins, with a man whose name deserves to be spoken slowly and remembered, because he is too often left out of the dramatic tellings. His name was Toribio Mejía. He was a Peruvian archaeologist, a man of the country, working in the 1920s under the great founding figure of Peruvian archaeology, Julio César Tello. And in the year 1926, note the year, for it matters, it is fully a decade and more before any of the famous airborne discoveries, Mejía walked out onto the Pampa and became, as far as the record shows, the first person to study the Nazca Lines systematically, as objects worthy of careful attention, rather than merely to notice them in passing as Cieza de León had done 4 centuries before. And he did it on foot. He did it from the ground, walking the lines, surveying them, tracing where they ran and how they met and crossed, setting down what he found. He had no airplane. He had no aerial photograph. He had his eyes and his feet and his patience, and with those he understood enough to propose an idea about what the lines were, and his idea was a quiet and sensible one. He suggested they were sacred roads, ceremonial pathways, something like the ritual lines the Inca would later lay out from their holy places, the radiating sacred routes that scholars call sects. Roads for walking, in other words, for processions, for pilgrimage, for some ceremony of movement across the land. He presented his findings at a conference in Lima at the end of the 1930s. It was the first real scholarly account of the lines the world had been given, and it came not from the air and not from a foreigner, but from a Peruvian on the ground, walking the desert his own people had always known. we will keep his name with us. Toribio Megia Zesp. He saw the lines plainly, and he saw them early, and he understood that they were made for feet. It is worth pausing a moment on that idea of his, the idea of sacred roads, because of all the early notions about the lines it has worn the best, and because it grew from looking rather than from imagining. The Inca, who came long after the people of Nazca, had a practice that we know a good deal about. They laid out, from their great holy temple in the city of Cusco, a set of radiating sacred lines, dozens upon dozens of them, reaching outward across the land toward shrines and springs and holy places, and along these lines they kept a vast calendar of rites and offerings. The Spanish chroniclers wrote about them. The lines were called secs, and they were at once spiritual and practical, a way of organizing the sacred geography of a whole people into spokes running out from a hub. Now, the Nazca culture was older than the Inca by 1,000 years and more, and we must be careful not to simply paint the one over the other. But Megia Zesp, walking the Pampa and watching the long straight lines run out toward distant points, recognized something of that same impulse, the idea that a line drawn across the land might be a thing you walk along with reverence, a road for the feet and the spirit both, leading from somewhere to somewhere for a reason. He could not prove it, but he had the shape of it, and he had it from the ground, and a great deal of careful work in the years since has bent back toward his patient guess. The makers, it seems more and more, were people who walked their lines. But here is where the sky comes in, and here is the part of the story that is true and worth telling carefully without letting it swell into something it was not. In the 1920s and into the 1930s, aviation came to Peru. The aeroplane, which had been a fragile novelty only a decade or two before, was becoming a working thing, and over the long, thin coast of Peru, with its great distances and its hard terrain, the aeroplane was especially useful. Pilots began flying the coastal routes, carrying mail and passengers and surveyors between the scattered towns. Some flew for the new commercial airlines. Some flew for the Peruvian military and the survey services, mapping the country from above, photographing it, charting the land in a way no one had ever been able to chart it before. And their routes took them again and again over the high, dry tableland between the river valleys, over the Pampa, over the very desert where the lines lay. Imagine it for a moment gently, because it is one of the quiet wonders of this whole story. A pilot in an open or half-open cockpit in the early decades of flight, droning slowly over the brown emptiness of the Peruvian coast at a few thousand feet. The land below is bare and pale and seemingly featureless, the kind of country your eye slides over without catching on anything, and then it catches. A line. A long, perfectly straight pale line, running across the desert below, too straight to be a riverbed, too long and too true to be anything the wind or the water made. And then another crossing it. And then perhaps the unmistakable shape of a thing, a great clean trapezoid, or the looping curve of some enormous figure, a bird or a creature drawn upon the ground in a single pale stroke longer than a row of houses. The pilot looks down at this from his rattling machine and cannot quite make sense of what he is seeing, because there is no sense to be made of it in the world he knows. Drawings that size on the ground in the middle of nowhere, he banks perhaps to look again. And then the route carries him on, and the desert closes its pale emptiness behind him, and he flies home with a thing in his memory he does not have words for. That is how the world above first met the lines, not in a single dramatic moment of discovery, but in scattered glimpses, by pilots and surveyors and passengers looking down out of the windows of early aircraft in the 1920s and 1930s, catching the impossible geometry of the Pampa and carrying the memory of it away. There was no one moment, no single name to which we can pin the rediscovery. It was the slow accumulation of people seeing from the new vantage of the air, a thing that had been lying in plain sight all along. The airplane did not create the lines, and it did not find lost lines, and it certainly was not needed to make them. The airplane simply gave human beings, for the first time, the one perspective from which the lines could be seen whole, and from that height, all at once, their full scale came clear in a way that no amount of walking on the ground could ever have revealed. The Pampa, seen from above, is covered. It is written over from edge to edge, and only from above can you take that in. It is here, with the sky now open, that the most famous figure in the early study of the lines comes onto the plane, an American historian named Paul Casa. He taught at Long Island University, and his real interest was not, at first, the lines at all. He had come to Peru to study the ancient irrigation systems of the desert coast, the canals and waterworks by which the old peoples had drawn water across the dry land and made it bloom. That is a worthy study in its own right, and we will come to the water in its own quiet hour. for it matters more to this desert than almost anything. But it was Cossack's interest in water and irrigation that first led him, around the year 1939, out onto the Pampa to look at the long straight lines because he wondered, reasonably enough, whether they might be the remains of ancient canals and channels for carrying water across the plain. He went to see whether the lines were waterworks. They were not. He found that quickly enough. The lines are shallow, mere scuffings of the surface, far too shallow ever to have carried water, and they run straight up the rises and down the dips without regard for the lay of the land in a way no canal ever would. So the irrigation idea fell away, but Cossack did not lose interest. He had begun to study the lines for themselves now, mapping them, walking them, photographing them, trying to understand what they were if they were not canals. And it was in the course of that study that he had the moment which has become, perhaps, the single most famous moment in the whole history of Nazca research. A moment so quiet and so human that it is easy to picture and easy to love. It was late on a day in June in the year 1941. Cossack had been out on the Pampa working among the lines, and the day was getting on toward evening. Now, June in the southern hemisphere is not summer but winter, and the particular day was around the 22nd of June, which falls at the winter solstice in that half of the world, the shortest day of the year, the day on which the sun reaches the lowest, northernmost point of its long yearly swing and pauses there before turning back. Cossack was standing, as the story goes, at the end of one of the long straight lines as the sun went down. And he watched the sun set, and it set, very nearly, directly at the far end of the line on which he stood, as though the line had been laid down on purpose to point at exactly that sunset, on exactly that day, the turning point of the solar year. It struck him like a key turning in a lock. Here was a line aimed at the solstice sun. And if one line pointed at a meaningful moment in the sky, perhaps others did too. Perhaps the whole vast tangle of lines on the Pampa was not random at all, but a kind of map of the heavens, a record of the risings and settings of the sun and the moon and the stars across the turning year. Standing there in the cooling desert with the winter sun going down at the end of his line, Cossack is said to have called the Pampa the largest astronomy book in the world. It is a marvelous phrase, and it launched an idea that would shape the study of the lines for decades to come. The notion that the Nazca Lines were a kind of astronomical calendar, written huge upon the ground, a way of marking the seasons and the solstices and the movements of the sky. We will weigh that idea in its own time gently, for it is neither wholly right nor wholly wrong, and the truth of what the lines meant is larger and stranger than any single theory. But for now it is enough to stand with Cossack at the end of his line in the winter dusk of 1941, watching the sun go down exactly where he did not expect it, and feeling the whole desert suddenly seem to mean something. That is a real moment, and it happened, and it is one of the small turning points from which all the later study of the lines flows. Cossack would not study the lines alone for long. The following year he was joined by a young German-born mathematician living in Lima, a woman named Maria Reiche, who would take up the work of mapping and measuring the lines and devote the rest of her long life to them. But she is a chapter of her own, and a great one, and we will come to her soon. For now we leave Cossack at his sunset, and we turn back, before we close, to the misunderstanding that this whole story tends to breed, because it is worth meeting calmly and setting gently to rest, the way we set the runways to rest in the chapter before. The misunderstanding goes like this. The lines can only be seen whole from the air. We discovered them from the air. Therefore, the reasoning slides forward without quite noticing the gap. The lines must have been meant to be seen from the air. And from there it is only a short and seductive step to the strangest version of all, that the makers themselves must somehow have been able to fly, or to see from above, in order to make drawings that only make sense from above. You have surely heard some version of this. It is the engine behind a great deal of the wilder speculation about the lines, the idea that no people on the ground, working with sticks and string, could possibly have laid out a creature longer than a row of houses and gotten the proportions right, because they could never have stepped back to see their work. Let us take that apart slowly and without heat, because it falls apart easily once you look at it. The mistake is to confuse how we rediscovered the lines with how they were made. Those are two entirely different things. We needed the air because we came to the lines as strangers from far away with no knowledge of them, wanting to see the whole pattern at once, spread out like a drawing on a table. But the makers did not come to the lines as strangers, they made them. They stood in the middle of the work day after day, and they did not need to see the whole at once, because they were building it piece by piece, with method on the ground. And we know we do not merely suppose, we know that the ground is enough because people have done it. In the early 1980s, an American investigator named Joe Nickel set out to test the claim directly. With a small team, using only the simplest tools, wooden stakes, lengths of cord, the kind of thing the ancient makers would have had, and working entirely from the ground with no aerial view of any kind, he laid out a full-sized copy of one of the Nazca figures on a flat field. He used a small drawing as a guide, scaled it up by careful measurement from staked center points, and walked the lines out with cord, exactly as we have imagined the ancient makers doing. And it worked. The reproduction came out accurate, so accurate that when it was photographed from the air and set beside the original, the likeness was remarked upon as remarkable in its exactness. A handful of people with sticks and string and patience reproduced one of the great figures faithfully, on the ground, without ever once leaving the ground to check their work. So the conclusion is plain, and it is a common one. The aerial view is how we found the lines. It is not how they were made, and it was never needed to make them. The layout works perfectly well from the ground, by the patient handing on of stake and cord we have already walked through together, sighting, measuring, scaling up from a small plan, keeping the line true across rise and dip. The makers did not need to fly. They did not need to see from above. They needed only what they plainly had, a flat, pale desert, a clear method and time. The wonder of the lines is not that they required some impossible vantage. The wonder is that they did not, that ordinary people, standing on the ground with the simplest of tools, made something so vast and so true that we, 2,000 years later, had to take to the sky just to see what they had done. And so the sky gives us a gift, but it is our gift, not theirs. We rise up over the Pampa now in our minds in the dark and the quiet, and we see what the early pilots saw, what Cossacks saw, what the surveyors photographing the coast saw out of the windows of their rattling machines. The whole desert written over edge to edge with lines and shapes and the great looping creatures, a vast pale pattern laid down by people who never once saw it whole and never needed to. The lines were always there. They were known and walked upon and written about for 4 centuries and more. What changed in our own age was only where we could stand to look. And from up here in the long gold evening light, with the winter sun going down at the end of a line that points at it, the Pampa does indeed look like a book, though what it says, and to whom, we are still slowly learning to read. Rest there a while, high and quiet over the desert, with nothing to find and nothing to solve. The lines have waited 2,000 years and more. They are in no hurry now, and neither are you. Let the Pampa spread out pale and patient below, and let your mind drift down toward it as slowly as the winter sun, in no hurry at all to land. We leave the little aircraft now, the way you set down a heavy thing you have been carrying a long while, gently, with both hands. Let the engine noise fade, and the great drawings on the desert floor below soften back into the brown and gray of the Pampa, and the figure of Paul Cossack, the man from Long Island who looked down from a small plane in the early 1940s and understood all at once that the lines below him were not roads or canals but something stranger. Let him step back a little into the haze of years. He saw the lines from the air and he understood that they meant something, and then, like so many who passed through this desert, he eventually went home, back across the water to Brooklyn and his teaching and his other work, and the lines were left as they had always been left, alone on the Pampa under the wheeling sun. But before he went, he handed the work to someone else, and the someone else did not go home. She stayed for 50 years. We are going to spend this quiet hour with her, slowly, in no hurry at all, for she is the gentlest figure in the whole long story and the most steadfast, and there is nothing in her life that need trouble your rest tonight. Her name was Maria Reiche, and she was born on the 15th of May in the year 1903 in the city of Dresden in Germany, far away across the world from the desert that would one day hold her. Dresden in those years was a city of stone bridges and old churches and the slow brown river Elbe, a city famous for music and porcelain and learning, and Maria grew up there in a comfortable and educated family, the eldest of 3 children. She was a serious child and a clever one, drawn early to the things that have clean and certain answers. She studied mathematics, she studied geography, she studied the languages of other countries, and she had a gift for them. By the end of her life, she would speak 5, moving between German and Spanish and English and French, and the old tongues of study as easily as walking between rooms. Picture her, if you like, as a young woman in Dresden in the 1920s, bent over her books in the long northern evenings, the lamplight on the page, the equations marching down the paper in their neat and patient rows. She did not yet know about the desert did not yet know about her. But mathematics is a kind of seeing. a way of finding the hidden order under the surface of things, and the habit of it was already growing in her, quietly, the way a root grows before there is any leaf above the ground. The world she grew up in was a hard one for a young person to make a steady life in. Germany after the First Great War was a country of trouble and uncertainty, of money that lost its worth between morning and evening, of work that came and went. And so in the year 1932, when Maria Reiche was 29 years old, she did a thing that many young people did in those years, and that very few of them did the way she would come to do it. She took a position abroad. She accepted work as a governess, a private teacher and caretaker for children in the household of the German consul in the old Andean city of Cusco, high in the mountains of Peru. It was meant, very likely, to be an ordinary chapter, a few years of work in a far country before the return home. She crossed the ocean. She climbed up into the thin, bright air of the Peruvian highlands, where the old Inca capital sat among its mountains, and she began the small daily work of teaching other people's children their lessons. She did not know that she had just arrived in the country where she would die. She did not know that she had come home. You can rest here a moment in the strangeness and the gentleness of that, how a whole life can turn on a job taken almost at random, in a year of trouble, by a young woman simply trying to make her way. She might have stayed a few years and gone back to Dresden. She might have done a dozen other things. Instead, slowly, Peru took hold of her, the way a country sometimes takes hold of a person who is only meant to pass through. She learned the Spanish language until it was as natural to her as her own. She moved in time down from the mountains toward the coast, toward the capital city of Lima, and she found work that suited her careful and exacting mind. She became a translator, turning documents and scientific writing from one language into another, work that rewards precision and patience, both of which she had in great supply. And it was through this world of scholars and translation and careful work that she came, at last, into the orbit of the man who would point her toward the desert. That man was Paul Cossack, the American historian we have already met, who had come to Peru to study the ancient systems of irrigation, the old canals and waterworks by which long-vanished peoples had coaxed crops out of one of the driest places on earth. In the early 1940s, Cossack needed someone in Peru who could read and reckon and translate, someone who understood mathematics and could help him with the measurements and the calculations his work required. Maria Reiche was exactly that someone. She became his assistant. And so it was that in the year 1941, working alongside Cossack, she first came to truly see the lines, the long straight tracks and the great drawn animals scratched into the desert floor of the Nazca Pampa, the figures that look like nothing at all from the ground and like the work of giants from the air. Cossack had begun to suspect that the lines might have something to do with the sky, with the rising and setting of the sun across the year, with the keeping of time. He had seen, the story goes, a line pointing exactly at the setting sun on the day of the solstice, and the thought had struck him that this was perhaps the largest astronomy book in the world, written across the desert in lines a person could walk along. It was a beautiful idea. And when Cossack, in time, returned to his life and his work in the United States, he left that beautiful idea behind him in the desert, and he left it in the hands of Maria Reiche. She took it up, that is the simplest way to say what happened, and the truest. From about the year 1946 onward, Maria Reiche took up the study of the Nazca Lines, and she did not put it down again for the rest of her life. She gave them, all told, roughly 50 years. Think on that number gently for a moment. 50 years, half a century, the better part of an entire human life, given over to a single stretch of desert and the marks upon it. People give their lives to many things, to children, to art, to faith, to a country, to a cause. Maria Reiche gave hers to a few square miles of stony ground in southern Peru, and to the patient work of measuring it and mapping it, and above all of keeping it safe. She never married, she had no children. The lines were the work, and the work was the life, and there was room in it, in the end, for very little else. What did the work look like day to day out there on the Pampa? It looked like the most patient labor you can imagine. The Nazca Desert is one of the driest places on the whole earth, a coastal desert where rain almost never falls, where the sun comes up hard and white every morning and beats down all the long day, where the wind moves across the open ground and the temperature climbs in the afternoon until the air shimmers above the stones. Into this place Maria Reiche went again and again, year after year, with her measuring tapes and her notebooks, with a sextant and a compass and the simple tools of careful surveying, and she walked the lines. She measured them, their length, their width, their direction, the exact angle each one made against the points of the horizon. She mapped them, drawing them down onto paper in careful scale, so that the great figures scattered across the desert could be held in the hand and studied and compared. She worked much of the time entirely alone, a solitary woman in a vast empty place, going out at dawn and staying until the light failed, sometimes living for weeks at a stretch in the desert itself, sleeping rough out there among the lines she was learning by heart. She climbed small ladders and stood on the few low hills to look out across the figures, because the only way to truly read a line is to rise above it. She rented small planes when she could afford to, and went up into the hot, bright air to photograph from above the shapes that her feet had measured below, marrying the view from the sky to the view from the ground. She lived for long stretches with almost nothing, a cot, a few tools, water carried in, the great silence of the Pampa pressing in on every side. It is hard even now to imagine the loneliness of it, the discipline of it, a woman going out day after day, year after year, into a place that gives a person nothing back but heat and distance, and the slow accumulation of careful numbers in a notebook. And here's the detail that more than any other has fastened itself to her memory, the small homely thing that turned her, in the eyes of the people who came to know of her, into something close to a legend. Maria Reiche swept the lines, she did. The figures on the Pampa are made by the simplest means imaginable, by clearing away the dark, sun-blackened stones that cover the desert's surface, and exposing the paler, lighter ground beneath, so that each line is really a long, shallow furrow swept clean of stones, a pale path against a dark floor. Over the centuries, blown sand and scattered pebbles and the slow drift of the desert had begun to fill them in again, to blur and soften their edges, to hide them. And so Maria Reiche, to keep them clear, to keep them legible, took up a broom, an ordinary household broom, the kind you would sweep a kitchen with, and she swept them. She went out onto the desert with her broom, and she swept the stones back out of the ancient furrows, clearing the lines the way the people who first made them had cleared them, 1,000 years and more before. Picture that slowly in the long gold light of a desert evening, a single figure alone in all that emptiness, bent over a broom, sweeping a line that runs straight off toward the horizon, sweeping and sweeping in the great silence, keeping a drawing clean that no one on the ground could even see was there. She wore out broom after broom on the stony desert. So many, the story goes, that the local people, watching this strange foreign woman alone among the lines with her broom day after day, began to whisper that perhaps she was a witch, for what else, they wondered, would a woman want with so many brooms, out there in the empty desert, talking to no one and sweeping the bare ground. There is something almost unbearably tender in that image, and you may let it hold you a while as you drift, for there is nothing frightening in it, only a kind of devotion so quiet and so strange that it could be mistaken for magic. She was not a witch, of course. She was a mathematician with a broom, doing the humblest possible work in the service of the largest possible idea, keeping clean by hand, one stone at a time, the marks that a vanished people had left upon the desert so that they would not be lost. It is the kind of work that has no end and no reward, that no one asks for and no one thanks you for, that simply has to be done again and again for as long as you can do it. And she did it for 50 years. She did more than sweep, though sweeping is what we remember. Out of her years of measuring and mapping, Maria Reiche built an argument about what the lines were for, and she carried that argument out into the world. In the year 1949, only a few years after she had truly begun, she published a book about her work, written in English, with a title that catches exactly the spirit of the thing she had given herself to. She called it Mystery on the Desert. In its pages, she set out the case that she would defend, in one form or another, for the rest of her life, the idea she had inherited from Cossack and then made thoroughly her own, that the great lines and figures of Nazca were a kind of vast astronomical calendar, a record written across the desert of the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars across the turning year. The lines, she believed, pointed at the places on the horizon where the sun rose and set at the solstices, where certain bright stars appeared and vanished with the seasons. The figures, she thought, might mark the constellations, or the times for planting and harvest, or the coming of the precious water down the dry valleys. To a people without writing, in a land where the rhythm of the seasons meant the difference between food and famine, such a calendar in the desert would have been a thing of enormous worth, a way of knowing where they stood in the great wheel of the year. It was, again, a beautiful idea, and Maria Reiche held to it with all the conviction of her exact and patient mind. It is only honest to tell you gently, as you rest, that the world of scholars no longer believes she was entirely right. The astronomical calendar theory, so dear to Maria Reiche, has lost most of its support among the archaeologists and astronomers who came after her. When later researchers tested the lines carefully against the sky, they found that no more pointed at meaningful points on the horizon than you would expect by simple chance, given how many lines there are running in every direction across the Pampa. The true purpose of the lines remains, even now, genuinely unknown, bound up, most scholars think, with water and ritual in the long walking of sacred paths, matters we will come to in other quiet hours of this night. But to say that Maria Reiche's theory has faded is not to say her life's work was wasted, far from it. She was the one who measured the lines when no one else would. She was the one who mapped them, who counted them, who recorded their dimensions with a care that later researchers, whatever they concluded, all had to build upon. And she was, above everything else, the one who saved them. For the lines were in danger, and that danger is the great cause of her later life. The Nazca Desert, for all its remoteness, was not untouched by the modern world. The great Pan-American Highway, the long road that runs the whole length of the Americas, was driven straight across the Pampa, and it cut, as it happens, directly through some of the figures, slicing across the long body of a lizard drawn upon the desert, as though the road simply had not seen it there. Cars and trucks left the road and drove out across the lines. People walked on them, parked on them, scratched their own marks beside the ancient ones. Tomb robbers dug in the desert. And every footprint, every tire track, every careless hand did damage to drawings that had survived 1,000 years only because almost no one had ever touched them. Maria Reiche understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, how fragile the lines truly were, how a thing that had lasted a millennium in the stillness of the desert could be ruined in an afternoon by a single vehicle. And so she became their guardian, fiercely and at her own cost. She did it much of the time out of her own pocket, which was never a deep one. She lived simply, almost severely, in a small house out at the edge of the desert, near the town of Nazca, close to the lines she watched over. She had no wealth and wanted none. And out of her own modest money, out of the small earnings of her book and her translation work, she paid for guards and men to watch the desert, to stop the cars driving onto the lines, to turn back those who would walk where they should not. She campaigned year after year, pressing the Peruvian government to protect the Pampa, to restrict who could go there and how. She argued that no one should be allowed to walk among the lines at all, for the ground itself was the drawing, and every step upon it was a small wound. And to give people a way to see the figures without harming them, she championed the building of a viewing tower, a tall metal platform, a mirador, raised up beside the highway, from which a visitor could climb and look down upon 2 or 3 of the great figures from above, the way they were meant to be seen, without ever setting foot upon the sacred ground. That tower stands to this day. People climb it still and look out over the desert and see the lines stretching away, and most of them have no idea that the reason they may look at all, and the reason there is anything left to look at, is a German mathematician with a broom who gave her whole life to keeping them safe. The people of Peru came to love her for it. She had arrived a foreigner, a governess from Dresden passing through, and she became, by the slow work of 50 years, one of the most honored figures in the country, the Lady of the Lines, they called her, the Keeper of the Pampa. The great universities of Lima gave her honorary doctorates. The nation took her, in the end, as its own. And the cause she had given her life to reached its crowning moment in the year 1994, when the lines and figures of Nazca were named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. The body of the United Nations that watches over the treasures of all humanity, placed on the same role as the pyramids and the great cathedrals and the wild and ancient places of the earth, recognized at last as belonging not to Peru alone, but to everyone forever. That recognition and the protection it brought owed more to Maria Reiche than to any other single person. She had spent half a century making the case, line by line, broomstroke by broomstroke, and at last the world had heard it. By then she was very old, and the desert had taken its toll. The fierce sun she had worked under for 50 years had ruined her skin. Her eyes, which had measured so many thousands of lines, slowly failed her until at last she went blind and could no longer see the figures she had given her life to. Her body weakened. She came to need a wheelchair to move about. And still, this is the part to hold gently as you drift down, still she worked. Blind and frail, she went on, dictating, remembering, advising, defending the lines she could no longer see. Her mind still walking the desert her body could no longer cross. She was not alone in those last years. Her younger sister, Renate, had come from Germany to be with her and to help her, and the 2 sisters lived out the end of their lives together near the desert, Renate caring for Maria as Maria had cared all those years for the lines. Maria Reiche died on the 8th of June in the year 1998 in Peru, in the country that had become entirely her own at the age of 95. The nation mourned her as it mourns its own great figures, and they did the thing that seems, when you hear it, exactly and perfectly right. They buried her near the desert, close to the lines she had spent 50 years protecting, so that she could rest at the last beside her life's work among the great drawings on the Pampa. In time, her sister Renate was laid beside her. The two of them lie there now at the edge of the desert under the same hard sun and the same wheeling stars that the makers of the lines once watched, near the long pale figures that go on running across the stony ground exactly as they have for more than 1,000 years, kept clean, kept safe, kept legible for all the years to come, because one woman crossed an ocean to teach a consul's children and stayed and picked up a broom. You may let her rest now and let yourself rest with her. There is no mystery in Maria Reiche that needs solving, no question left aching and open the way the lines themselves leave so many. Her life is one of the few wholly settled and peaceful things in this whole long story, a beginning in Dresden, a crossing of the sea, a desert, a broom, a tower, a half-century of patient devotion, and a grave among the lines at the end of it all. She found the thing she was for, which is more than most of us ever do, and she gave herself to it completely. And the thing she protected outlived her, as she surely hoped it would, and goes on outliving her still, out there in the dark desert tonight while you lie warm and safe and slipping down towards sleep. Somewhere on the Nazca Pampa, under the cold bright stars, the great lines lie clean and quiet, swept long ago by a hand that loved them. And in the next quiet hour we will go out and walk among them ourselves and ask what the people who first drew them might have meant. But that is for later, and there is no hurry at all. For now there is only the desert and the stars above it and the long patient lines and the quiet keeping of a faithful keeper who watched over them so that we might still, all these years later, simply wonder. Let it carry you down. Sleep well. We set Maria Reiche's instruments down gently now, and the calendar she spent half a century defending, the sun setting along a chalk-straight line on the day of a solstice, the seasons written into the desert floor in stone. All of that can rest where it lies, a careful and devoted reading by a careful and devoted woman, not wrong so much as too small to hold the whole. For she had answered one question, what some of the lines might point to in the turning of the year, and left a larger one untouched, the question that comes before all the others when you stand in a place like this. We are going to turn toward that larger question now, slowly, the way you turn toward something you have been circling for a long while without quite naming it. And it is the plainest question there is, the one a child would ask first, looking out over that endless sun-cracked plain. Not what do the lines mean, but how did anyone live here at all? There is nothing in what follows that need trouble you. It is only a story about thirst, and about the long, patient cleverness of people who were thirsty, and you may let it carry you wherever you are going tonight. Begin with the dryness itself, because the dryness is the beginning of everything here. The Nazca lived on the southern coast of Peru, in a strip of desert pressed between the cold gray Pacific to the west and the high wall of the Andes to the east, and it is one of the driest inhabited places on the face of the earth. Some years it does not rain at all, not a shower, not a passing cloud that breaks, nothing. The cold Humboldt current runs up the coast and chills the air above the sea so that the moisture never rises and never falls, and the great mountains to the east catch what little weather there is and wring it dry before it can cross over. So the rain that the Nazca needed did not fall on the Nazca. It fell high in the Andes, far away and out of sight, on peaks they could see on a clear day standing blue and remote on the eastern horizon. And then, weeks or months later, if they were fortunate, that distant rain came down to them through the rivers, a little of it sometimes when the mountains had been generous. And sometimes it did not come at all, and the rivers ran dry over their stones, and the year became a matter of survival. Consider what they were trying to keep alive out there. The Nazca were farmers, and they grew the staples that the dry coast would allow them: maize, the corn that fed them, beans and squash, cotton for their cloth, and fruit trees clinging to the valley floors. None of it could grow on rain that did not fall. Every kernel and every fiber depended on the water that arrived from somewhere else, channeled and coaxed and parceled out across the thin green ribbon of the valley while the desert pressed in on either side. A people like that does not have the luxury of treating water as one concern among many. Water is the whole of it. Water is the year's whole story, told over and over, with the same anxious beginning every spring and an ending that no one could read in advance. This is the fact you must hold above all the others tonight, because everything else rests upon it. Water did not belong to these people. It came to them, or it did not, from a place they could not reach, on a schedule they could not predict, and there was nothing they could do to make it fall. You can imagine, perhaps, what that does to people over the long generations, how it would settle into the bones of a culture. How water would become not merely a resource but the central preoccupation, the thing prayed for and pleaded for and watched for, the difference each single year between a living valley and a dying one. And when you hold that fact in your mind and then you look again at the lines scratched across that thirsty plain, they begin to look a little different. They begin to look less like a riddle and more like an answer to the only question that ever truly mattered out there. This is the explanation that most archaeologists today find the most persuasive, and it is worth saying plainly before we walk into it. The lines in this reading are about water. They are about asking the dry earth and the distant mountains for water, and the fertility that water brings, in a land where asking was very nearly all that anyone could do. It is not a single dramatic theory with a single clever author. It is something slower and sturdier than that, a picture that several careful people built up over decades, each adding a piece, until the picture held together on its own. One of the people who built it was an American anthropologist named Johann Reinhard, who came to the Nazca question not as a desk theorist, but as a man who had spent years high in the Andes, among the people who still live there, watching what they actually do and listening to what they actually say about the mountains and the rain. And what Reinhard understood, in a way that the astronomers poring over their star charts had not, was that for the peoples of the Andes, the mountains themselves are alive. They are deities, the Apis, the great mountain lords, and they are the keepers and the givers of water, because it is from the mountains, in plain physical fact, that the water comes. To ask a mountain for rain is not, in that world, a quaint superstition laid over a misunderstanding of the weather. It is a direct address to the one place from which water has always, observably, descended. The mountain gives the rain, so you speak to the mountain. And the way you speak to a mountain, in many of the living traditions Reinhard studied, is with your feet. You walk. You make a procession, a sacred path, a journey performed with the body across the land, and the walking is itself the prayer. Reinhard's argument, which he laid out in the 1980s and refined for years after, was that the long, straight Nazca Lines were exactly this: ritual pathways, ceremonial roads, walked by people in procession as an act of petition to the mountain gods and the water deities for rain and for the fertility of the fields. The lines were not meant to be seen whole from above by anyone. They were meant to be walked along the ground, one foot after another, by people who were asking the earth in the oldest and most physical language there is, please, please send the water down. You can hold that image for a moment because it is a gentle one and it sits easily in the mind at this hour. A line of people in the cool of early morning, walking out across the pale floor of the desert, following a path their grandparents walked and their grandparents before them. The path is dead straight. It runs for a mile, 2 miles longer toward a notch in the distant blue mountains where everyone knows the water lives. There is no hurry in the walking. There is only the rhythm of it, the slow, patient procession across the cracked earth, and the asking carried in the feet, repeated and repeated as the sun comes up. Whether the rain came that year or did not, the walking was the thing that could be done, and so they did it with great care for hundreds of years. And there is a place that anchors this picture, a real place out at the edge of the desert where the lines and the people came together, called Cahuachi. It was the great ceremonial center of the Nazca, a sprawl of earthen mounds and pyramids and open plazas raised from adobe at the desert's rim, beside the river, and it was not really a city in the way we would mean the word. People did not crowd into it to live. They came to it in their seasons to gather and to worship and to make their offerings, and then they went home again to their scattered valleys, and the place stood mostly empty between the great occasions, a city of the gods rather than of daily bread. Many of the lines and the long cleared trapezoids lie out across the plain in the country around Cahuachi, and it is easy, standing in that ground, to feel how the two belong to one another, the temple at the center, and the radiating paths along which the faithful walk to reach it, and to perform their ceremonies of water and of rain. Inside the ruined rooms of Cahuachi, archaeologists have found exactly the offerings you would expect of such a people. Pottery filled with corn, gourd rattles, fine painted ware, textiles and shells, the gathered tokens of an agricultural people asking the powers of the world to keep their fields alive. The lines did not lead nowhere. They led in body and in spirit to the asking. Other careful people added their pieces to this picture. The archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni, who came to Nazca prepared by training to find the lines aligned with stars and solstices, instead found something quieter and more earthbound. He and his colleagues mapped the lines not as isolated marks but as a network, and they noticed that the straight lines radiate outward from points they came to call ray centers, low hills and rises scattered across the Pampa from which lines fan out in every direction like spokes. And when Avani looked at where those ray centers sat and where the lines pointed, the pattern that emerged was not a pattern of the heavens. It was a pattern of water. The ray centers clustered near the places where water entered the valley. The lines reached out toward rivers, toward springs, toward the courses that the precious water ran when it ran at all. Many of the great trapezoids, those long, broad-cleared shapes, wider at one end than the other, opened toward water sources, as if pointing, as if marking, as if the whole enormous network had been laid down to trace and honor the geography of the thing the people most needed. Persis Clarkson, a Canadian archaeologist, walked the lines and dated the pottery left along them, and added her own work to the same growing understanding that these were not the marks of stargazers, but the worn pathways of a people enacting their relationship to water across the surface of the land, over many generations, through ceremony and procession, and the patient, repeated business of asking. And here is a detail that lands the theory in something you can almost touch. Out on the lines, on them and beside them, at the ray centers and along the trapezoids, archaeologists have found offerings. Not treasure offerings. Pottery, much of it deliberately broken, smashed on purpose as part of the rite, the way an offering is given up rather than kept, and shells. Shells of a particular kind called spondylus, the spiny oyster with its deep warm reds and oranges, and the spondylus does not live in the cold gray water off the Nazca coast. It lives far to the north, in the warm tropical seas off Ecuador, hundreds of miles away, and it had to be carried all that distance at real cost and real effort to arrive in the desert. The spondylus shell all across the ancient Andes was the sacred emblem of water and of rain. To carry it down into that thirsty place and lay it on the lines as an offering is to say, as plainly as objects can say anything, that the lines were about water. That the people who walked them were asking for rain, and giving the rain's own sacred shell in exchange for the hope of it. So we are not guessing entirely. We are reading the things the people themselves left behind, laid down with their own hands on the surface of the desert, and the things point one direction. They point toward water. And then there is the most quietly astonishing piece of all, the piece that turns the whole story from a matter of prayer into a matter of engineering, because the Nazca did not only ask for water, they went and got it. Scattered through the valleys around the modern town of Nazca, there are structures called puquios, and once you understand what they are, you do not easily forget them. From the surface, a puquio looks like a strange spiral pit, a corkscrew of stone-lined terraces winding down into the earth, narrowing as it descends, as if someone had drilled a great screw thread down into the desert floor and then walked away. There are rows of them in some places, these spiraling stone eyes, the ojos, the eyes, set 10 to 30 meters apart in a line across the dry ground, and they are not pits. They are the access shafts to an underground water system of real genius, long horizontal galleries, stone-lined tunnels dug down to the water table some 10 meters beneath the surface, that tap the groundwater where it hides and channel it, sloping gently downhill for hundreds of meters underground, out toward the open ditches and the fields and the people waiting for it in the dry air above. Think about what that solves. In a place where the surface water vanishes for half the year or longer, where the rivers run dry and the rain refuses to fall, the puquios reach beneath the dead surface to the living water underneath, the water seeping invisibly down from the distant mountains through the gravel of the valley floor, and they bring it up and carry it, shaded and cool and protected from the fierce evaporating sun, all the way to where it is needed. The underground galleries run roughly a meter square, just wide enough for a person to crawl along and clear them, and some of them reach for hundreds of meters before they surface. One of them, measured carefully, runs for some 370 meters underground before it opens to the light. Where they emerge, the water spills into open stone-lined trenches, narrow ditches that carry it out the last stretch to the canals and the fields. The spiral eyes, the ojos, were not decoration. They let in the workers who kept the tunnels clear, generation after generation, and they let in the wind, and there is a clever notion that the funneling of that desert wind down into the shafts helped push the water through the system and keep it moving. It is an answer to the desert written not in chalk on the ground, but in stone beneath it, and it is the same answer: water, water, get the water, hold the water, keep the water moving, that the lines and the offerings and the long processions were asking for above. And the most moving thing about the puquios is that many of them still work. They were built perhaps 1,500 years ago, and they have never stopped. Around the year 2000, surveys counted 43 puquios still functioning in the region, 29 of them clustered near the city of Nazca itself, still drawing groundwater up out of the earth, still feeding the open channels, still watering the fields and the people of a dry valley after 15 centuries of unbroken service. There are farmers alive today who irrigate their crops with water flowing through tunnels dug by the same hands that scratched the spider and the hummingbird into the plain. The mystery and the living town drink from the same source. That is not a thing you find in many places on Earth. For a long time, the puquios sat a little apart from the lines in the way people thought about Nazca. The lines a riddle, the puquios a piece of clever plumbing, two separate marvels of one vanished people. And then in the year 2016, an Italian researcher named Rosa Lasapanara, working with Nicola Massini and their team, brought the two together by looking down from space. Using satellite imagery, they mapped the puquios across the whole region, found that the system had once been far larger than the surviving pieces suggested, traced its hidden lines through the drainage basin, and they studied how the entire network was distributed across the land. And what they showed was that the puquios were laid out in tight relationship to where the underground water actually ran, and that the great geoglyphs above them, the lines, the trapezoids, the cleared shapes on the surface, sat in relationship to that same distribution of water, the same hidden plumbing of the valley. The marks on the surface and the channels beneath the surface were reading the same map. They were two halves of one obsession. The Nazca had organized their entire landscape, above ground and below, around the search for water and the asking for water, and from orbit, 15 centuries later, you could still see the shape of that single overwhelming need pressed into the desert. When you carry that understanding back to the figures themselves, the great animals scratched into the plain that we walked among in an earlier hour, they too begin to speak the language of water. The spider, in the symbolic world of the ancient Andes, was associated with rain, a creature reed in the sky and the weather. The monkey, an animal of the deep green Amazon on the far side of the mountains, carried the association of that distant rain-soaked forest and all its rivers, the very source of the water that the Nazca lived and died waiting for. The hummingbird and the pelican and the other birds carried associations of water and of fertility, of the wet, abundant places that the desert was not. None of this is to flatten the figures into a single dull meaning. It is only to notice that when a thirsty people draws enormous images of living things across their land, the things they choose to draw are, again and again, the creatures their world connected to rain. The whole desert, read this way, becomes a single long prayer for water, written in lines and shapes and animals across 40 miles of ground, walked and tended, and offered to for the better part of 1,000 years. And then gently the prayer was not enough. For all of it, the lines, the processions, the offerings carried from the warm northern sea, the brilliant underground tunnels reaching down to the hidden water, none of it could finally master the thing it was built to plead with. Somewhere around the year 600 and on through the next century and a half, the Nazca culture declined and faded, and the reasons for its ending are bound up, as everything here is bound up with water. There was drought, the deep merciless drought of that coast when the mountains withhold their rain for season after season. And there was the opposite too, the violent catastrophic flooding of the great El Niño years, when the warm water gathers in the Pacific and the sky over the desert does the unthinkable and opens, and the dry riverbeds become torrents that tear the careful irrigation works to pieces. The Nazca lived their whole existence balanced on the narrow knife between too little water and too much, and in the end the knife turned. There is a piece of research here by an archaeologist named David Beresford Jones that gives the ending a particular and human sharpness, and it is worth holding as we begin to drift toward the close. Beresford Jones studied the lower valleys and found that the land had once been held together by a tree, the huarango, a remarkable desert tree with one of the deepest root systems known, a tree that fixes nitrogen and enriches the thin soil, that holds moisture and shelters the ground beneath its canopy from the punishing sun and the scouring wind. The huarango was the keystone, the quiet green anchor that made the desert floodplain livable at all. And over the long generations, the Nazca cleared it slowly, reasonably, a little at a time, cutting the forest back to plant their cotton and their maize, each clearing sensible on its own, each one bringing a little more land into use. Until somewhere they crossed a line they could not see. With the trees gone, the soil lost its hold and its moisture. The wind scoured the exposed land, and when a great El Niño flood finally came, there was nothing left to anchor the floodplain. The river cut down into its own bed, the irrigation systems were ruined, and the land that had fed them became unworkable. They had asked the earth for water their whole long history, and in the end it was the slow loss of the trees, their own patient hands, generation by generation, doing what seemed only sensible, that left them unable to hold the water when at last it came, all at once, and took everything. There is no villain in that ending, and no sudden catastrophe you can point to and blame. There is only a people who lived at the very edge of what their dry land could give, who were clever and devoted and faithful beyond almost any measure, who walked their prayers across the desert and dug their tunnels down to the buried water and carried sacred shells 1,000 miles to lay upon the ground, and who in the end, like all of us, could not finally outrun the limits of the place they lived in. Water was the thing they organized their entire world around. Water was what the lines asked for and what the puquios delivered and what the offerings honored. And water, in the end, in its absence and then in its terrible excess, was the thing they lived and died by. It is a quieter story than the riddle the lines first seemed to pose, and a truer one, and there is a kind of peace in it. Not the cold peace of a solved puzzle, but the warm peace of understanding a people from the inside, of seeing that the marks on the plain were never a secret message meant to baffle the future, but the most ordinary and most desperate thing in the world made beautiful. People who were thirsty, asking for rain. People walking out at dawn across the cracked earth toward the distant blue mountains, asking with their feet, the way you might once have walked somewhere you loved without knowing why your body needed to make the journey. The desert keeps their footpaths still. The water still rises through their tunnels, and the great drawings lie out there in the dark now under the same dry stars the walkers walked beneath, holding their simple human longing in perfect stillness, asking nothing of you at all. Let that long procession move on across the plain without you now, fading into the dark at the foot of the mountains, the asking carried gently away on feet that have been walking for 1,500 years and are in no hurry to stop. There is water somewhere beneath the dry ground, moving slowly through the stone, patient and cool and unseen, the way sleep moves toward you now through the quiet of the room. You need not reach for it, it is already coming, let it come. We set the water down gently now, the long-buried aqueducts, the spiral wells turning down into the cool, dark earth, the mountain gods who were thought to send the rain, the whole great thirst of this desert, and the people who learned to live inside it. All of that can rest where it lies, like a clay vessel set carefully back upon its shelf at the end of a long day's drawing of water. We are going to lift our eyes now, away from the ground and the lines drawn upon it, up and away from the cracked Pampa toward the one thing that this driest of places has always had in abundance, the thing it owns more completely than almost anywhere else on earth. We are going to look at the sky. Because the sky over the Nazca Desert is something to behold. There is almost no rain here, which means there is almost no cloud, and there is no city for many miles, which means there is almost no light. And so when the sun goes down behind the dark folds of the foothills, the stars do not so much appear as descend, coming down in their thousands and then their tens of thousands until the whole dome of the night is crowded edge to edge with them, low and close and impossibly bright. The band of the Milky Way arches over the Pampa like a road of pale smoke. The dark spaces between the stars, the great dust clouds that the Andean peoples knew and named and watched, hang there in the brightness like shapes cut out of the light. This is a sky that a person could learn. This is a sky that a person, watching night after night, year after year, generation after generation, could come to know the way you know the rooms of your own house in the dark. And so it is no surprise at all that when the first careful students of these lines stood out upon the Pampa and wondered what the lines were for, they looked up and they thought, perhaps, the answer is written there. The man who looked up first in any serious way was Paul Cossack. We have met him already earlier in the night, the American historian from Long Island University who came to Peru at the very end of the 1930s to study the ancient irrigation systems of the coast, and who found instead these long, strange lines scratched across the desert and could not let them go. Cossack was a careful man, a scholar, and at first he had no idea what the lines were. He walked them, he photographed them. He puzzled over them, and then, in the Peruvian winter of 1941, on or near the 22nd of June, he had the moment that would set the course of everything that followed. He was standing at the end of one of the long lines as the day was ending, and as he watched, the sun went down, and it set very nearly directly along the line he was standing on. The 22nd of June in the southern hemisphere is the winter solstice, the shortest day, the moment when the sun reaches the farthest, lowest turn of its yearly journey and pauses and begins to climb back. Cossack stood there in the cooling air and watched the sun settle down along the line as if the line had been drawn to catch it, and a thought arrived that must have felt very much like revelation. He would later call the Nazca Pampa the largest astronomy book in the world. He believed in that moment that he was looking at a calendar, an enormous calendar written across the desert in lines miles long, each one perhaps aimed at the rising or setting of the sun or the moon or some important star on some important day, a vast instrument for marking the turning of the agricultural year. It is worth pausing to feel how reasonable that idea was and how beautiful. For a farming people in a desert, the year is everything. When will the rivers run? When will the floods come down from the mountains? When should the seed go into the ground? These questions are the difference between eating and not eating, and the only reliable clock for answering them is the sky, the slow march of the sun north and south along the horizon through the year, the appearance and disappearance of certain stars in the dawn. A people who lived and died by that clock would have every reason to study it closely, and perhaps to mark it permanently upon the ground. Cossack's idea was not a fantasy. It was a hypothesis, a good one, grounded in the real needs of real people, and he had a sunset that seemed to prove it. And then Cossack did the thing that good fortune sometimes arranges. He found the person who would devote her entire life to testing his idea. Her name was Reiche, and she is the figure who, more than any other, belongs to these lines. She was German by birth, born in Dresden in 1903, trained as a mathematician, and she had come to Peru in the 1930s working as a governess and a translator. She met Cossack, she heard about the lines, and something in her, the mathematician perhaps, the woman who saw geometry where others saw only scratches and dust, answered to them completely. When Cossack eventually returned to the United States, Reiche stayed, and she did not just stay for a season, she stayed for the rest of her life. For more than half a century, Maria Reiche walked the Nazca Pampa. She measured the lines with tape and compass and her own 2 feet, mapping their bearings, recording their angles, working out the geometry of the great figures, and she became convinced, as Cossack had been, that the lines were astronomical, that they pointed at the solstices, at the equinoxes, at the rising points of stars. She paid particular attention to the Pleiades, that small, tight cluster of stars whose appearance in the dawn sky was tied, all across the ancient Andes, to the coming of water and the timing of the planting. She believed the lines and the figures together formed a giant astronomical calendar, a way of holding the year still and reading it. She published her findings in a book whose title says everything about her conviction, Mystery on the Desert. And she did more than study the lines, she guarded them. She lived for decades in a small house at the edge of the desert, sometimes literally sleeping out on the Pampa, and she fought with money out of her own pocket, with the sheer force of her presence, to keep the lines from being driven over, built upon, destroyed. She hired guards, she lobbied the government. When the lines were finally protected, when they were finally named a World Heritage Site, it was in no small part because one stubborn German mathematician had refused for 50 years to let the world forget them. By the time she died in 1998, an old woman nearly blind, she had become a national figure in Peru, buried with honors. The lines, in a real sense, were saved by the astronomical theory, saved by the love it inspired in the woman who believed it. So you might think the matter settled. The lines are a calendar, the sky is the key, the great mathematician proved it. But here is where the night asks us to slow down and be honest, the way we have tried to be honest with every story so far, because a beautiful idea, however lovingly held, still has to face the test of measurement. And the test came in 1968, and it did not go the way Cossack and Reiche had hoped. The man who brought the test was an astronomer named Gerald Hawkins. Hawkins was, at that moment, one of the most famous archaeoastronomers alive. A few years earlier, he had published a book called Stonehenge Decoded, in which he had fed the alignments of that ancient stone circle in England into a computer, a rare and powerful thing in those days, and argued that Stonehenge was a kind of astronomical machine, a calculator for predicting the movements of the sun and moon and even eclipses. He had become the man who used the cold arithmetic of the computer to read the intentions of the ancient skywatchers. And so it was natural that he should turn, with the backing of the National Geographic Society, to the largest sky puzzle of all, the lines of Nazca. Hawkins and his team surveyed the Pampa carefully, and they took the bearings of a large sample of the lines, something like 186 of them, and they fed those bearings into the computer. The question was simple. If the lines were aimed at the sky, at the sunrise and sunset points of the solstices, at the moon, at the rising of the bright stars 2,000 years ago, accounting for the slow drift of the heavens across the centuries, then far more of them should point at something important than you would expect from lines drawn at random. So they ran the numbers, and the numbers came back, and the answer was no. A handful of the lines did line up with solar or lunar events, but only about as many as you would get if you had drawn 186 lines across the desert blindfolded and then gone looking for the sky to match them. The matches were no better than chance. There were so many lines pointing in so many directions that some of them were bound to aim at something in the sky as crowded as Nazca's. Hawkins concluded that the grand idea, the master calendar, the great astronomy book of the world, could not be supported. The sky, it seemed, was not the key after all. It is a quiet, deflating moment, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because there is a lesson in it that goes far beyond Nazca. The human mind is a pattern-finding engine of extraordinary power, and the night sky and a desert full of lines are both so rich, so crowded with possibility, that a determined person can almost always find a match between them. Draw enough lines, name enough stars, and coincidence will hand you all the alignments you could wish for. Hard discipline, the thing Hawkins brought, the thing that is genuinely difficult, is to ask not whether some lines point at the sky, but whether they point at the sky more often than random chance would explain. And by that harder test, the comprehensive calendar simply did not hold. This does not mean Cossack and Reiche were foolish. It means they were human, looking at a beautiful pattern and wanting it to be true, which is the most understandable thing in the world. The sunset Cossack saw was real. It was just not, by itself, proof. And yet, and this is why the honest answer is more interesting than either the grand claim or the flat dismissal, the story does not quite end with Hawkins's computer. Because not long after, another careful scholar came to the Pampa and asked a more patient question and got a more interesting answer. His name was Anthony Aveni, an astronomer and anthropologist who is, more than anyone, the founder of the modern study of how ancient peoples watched the sky. Aveni did not arrive wanting to prove a grand calendar, nor to debunk one. He arrived wanting to look slowly and locally, line by line, and to set what he found against what the archaeologists actually knew about the people who lived here. And what Aveni found was a middle thing, a quieter and truer thing. He found that some of the lines do, in fact, have astronomical meaning. A number of them align with the sun, and crucially, they align with the sun at the times of year that mattered most in this desert, the times tied to water. In the Nazca Valley, the rivers run and the precious water comes down from the mountains at a particular season, and some of the lines appear to point at the place on the horizon where the sun sets around the time those life-giving floods arrive. So the sky and the water are not separate stories at all. They are the same story. The astronomy that the lines record is not abstract star charting for its own sake. It is the astronomy of a farmer watching the horizon to know when the river will run. Aveni also studied how the lines radiate outward from certain hubs, points on the Pampa from which lines spread like the spokes of a wheel, and he saw in them an echo of something documented far to the south, in Inca Cusco, the Sec system, lines of sacred direction that organized worship and water and the calendar all at once. The lines, in Aveni's reading, were walked. They were ritual paths, paths to be moved along in procession, very likely in ceremonies that asked the sky and the mountains for water. So here is the honest verdict, and it is worth holding gently because it satisfies neither the believers nor the scoffers. Astronomy is one thread in the Nazca Lines, a real thread, woven through the whole, but only one thread among several. The lines are not a master calendar that decodes neatly into a star map. Neither are they astronomically empty. The truth lives in between, where the truth so often lives. People who watched the sky closely because their lives depended on water, who marked some directions that mattered to both, and who used these long walked lines for purposes that were religious and social and practical all at once, in ways we can partly recover and partly never will. The sky is in it. The sky is just not all of it. There is one more astronomical idea worth setting down before we let the matter rest, because it concerns the most beloved of all the figures. Out on the Pampa there is a great spider, perhaps 46 meters long, drawn in a single unbroken line. And an astronomer named Phyllis Pitluga, who worked at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago and who had studied with Maria Reich herself, proposed that the spider was a map of the heavens, specifically, that it was a kind of distorted diagram of the constellation we call Orion. and that 3 straight lines running off from the figure were drawn to track the slow changing rise of the 3 stars of Orion's belt across the centuries. It is a striking idea, and you can feel the pull of it, the great desert spider as a portrait of a constellation. But it has been seriously questioned, and the man who questioned it most sharply was Avani himself. He pointed out that Petluga had never clearly explained why she chose the particular lines she chose, that she had ignored most of the figure's other lines, and that she had paid little attention to what the archaeologists actually knew about the spider and its makers. The Orion spider remains a possibility, a lovely one but an unproven one, a thread that might be real and might be only another pattern the eager mind has found in a crowded sky. Now there's one more sky story attached to these lines, and we should turn to it plainly and gently, the way you turn to a strange rumor about a place you have come to love, not to mock it, but to understand it and set it kindly aside. Because if you have heard anything at all about the Nazca Lines before tonight, there's a fair chance it was this, that they were made by or for visitors from the stars, that the long straight lines are runways, that the desert is an alien airport. This idea has a single, traceable origin, and it is the same year as Hawkins's study, 1968. That year, a Swiss writer named Erich von Däniken published a book called Chariots of the Gods. It was a sensation, one of the best-selling books of its era, eventually selling tens of millions of copies around the world, and its argument, applied to ruins and artworks all across the globe, was always the same, that ancient people were too primitive to have built the wonders they built, and so the wonders must have been built with the help of extraterrestrial visitors. When von Däniken came to Nazca, he looked at the long straight lines stretching for miles across the flat desert, and he said, "Those are landing strips, runways for spacecraft." The figures, he suggested, were signals or markers laid out for eyes in the sky. And because the book was vivid and confident and arrived at exactly the right cultural moment, the image lodged itself in the popular imagination and has never entirely left. So let us be fair to it, and then let us be clear. It is on its face an understandable mistake. From the air, some of the long cleared lines and trapezoids do look a little like runways, long, flat, pale strips on the desert floor. If you knew nothing else, you might think it too. But once you know even a little more, the idea simply dissolves, and it does so for several plain reasons, none of them angry, all of them just facts. The first is time. The Nazca Lines were made by the Nazca people and their predecessors over a long span running roughly from 500 years before the Common Era to around 500 years after it, which is to say they were already ancient, already 1,000 years old and more, by the time the first true aircraft, a fragile wooden canvas thing, lifted a few feet off a beach in 1903. The lines predate any flying machine by some 2,000 years. A runway with no aircraft built 2 millennia before anything could land on it is not a runway. The second reason is the ground itself. Picture again what this desert floor actually is: not packed concrete, but a thin crust of dark stones lying over soft, fine, pale soil. The lines themselves were made by sweeping that thin layer of stones aside. The makers could clear a line with their hands and feet because the surface gives so easily. That same softness is why the lines have survived 2,000 years almost untouched. Almost nothing happens here to disturb them. But it is also exactly why nothing heavy could ever land on them. A craft of any real weight touching down would not roll smoothly along a runway. It would sink into the soft earth and bog down. The ground that preserved the lines so perfectly is the very ground that proves they were never meant to be landed upon. The third reason is the people. We are not missing the makers of these lines. This is not a blank where a mystery has to be invented to fill it. We have the Nazca culture in rich and growing detail, their towns, their cemeteries, their irrigation, their astonishing painted pottery, their woven textiles, the very same animals and plants and beings that appear in their pottery appearing again, drawn huge, out on the Pampa. The spider, the monkey, the hummingbird, the killer whale, these are Nazca art made by Nazca hands in the Nazca style. The lines are not foreign to this place. They are signed, in a sense, all over by a people we know. And the fourth reason is the simplest and most satisfying of all, because it does not argue, it just shows. In 1982, a careful investigator named Joe Nickel decided to answer the question of whether ordinary people with ordinary tools could really have made these things. He did not theorize. He went out into a field in Kentucky with a small group of family and friends, armed with nothing but wooden stakes, lengths of cord, and a simple method of marking out points from a small drawing onto a large one. and in a matter of days with that humble equipment, they laid out a full-sized copy of the great Nazca Condor, some 440 feet of it, accurate enough that when it was compared with the original, Scientific American called the likeness remarkable in its exactness. No technology, no machines, certainly nothing from the stars, just stakes and string and patience and a clear human plan. Nickel proved in the gentlest possible way what the archaeologists had been saying all along, that a desert people with rope and stakes and a great deal of care could absolutely have made every line and every figure on the Pampa exactly as they appear with their own hands. So we can set the runways down too, without scorn. The idea was never wicked, only a kind of failure of imagination, a failure to believe that ancient people, our own ancestors in the human family, could be as clever and as capable and as full of vision as they plainly were. The real story is better than the alien one, not worse. A people who watched the sky until they knew it by heart, who tracked the sun to the day the water would come, who walked great lines in procession to ask the mountains for rain, and who drew with rope and patience enormous beautiful creatures that they themselves would never see whole from above. That is a far more astonishing thing than a runway. It asks more of us and it gives back more, and it has the additional quiet virtue of being true. So let the sky rest now where it belongs, low and crowded and brilliant over the dark Pampa. The sun will set tonight where it has set for 2,000 years, sliding down behind the foothills along some line that someone long ago swept clear with their hands to catch exactly this moment. The Pleiades will rise before the dawn, and the farmers who are long since dust once read in them the coming of the water. Gerald Hawkins's verdict and Anthony Aveni's gentler one and old Maria Reiche out on the desert with her tape measure and her stubborn love. They are all part of the one slow conversation that this place keeps having with the people who come to read it. A conversation that has been going on for a very long time and is in no hurry to end. There is no fear in any of it. There is only the wide dark sky and the long pale lines beneath it and the patient turning of the year that they were drawn in part to hold. Let it turn. There is nothing here you need to carry. Only the stars coming down in their thousands and the desert breathing its slow, cool breath beneath them, and the long lines lying quiet in the dark, waiting as they have always waited for the sun. We have spent these long hours looking up at the stars wheeling slowly over the desert, at the theories that have tried, one after another, to read the lines as a calendar or a map of the heavens or a message meant for someone watching from above. We have weighed the careful work of the astronomers and the dowsers and the dreamers, and we have let most of it settle gently to the ground. And now in this last quiet hour, we turn our eyes back down from the sky and onto the desert floor itself, and onto the people who knelt there in the sun and made these marks with their own hands. Because the deepest answer to the riddle of the Nazca Lines was never hiding among the stars. It was here all along in the dust, in the broken pottery, in the bones, in the seed husks, in the old dry irrigation channels, in the lives of the people themselves. There is nothing here that needs to worry you now. This is the gentlest part of the whole long journey, the part where the mystery quietly becomes a memory, and the memory becomes something tender, and the tenderness lowers you, at last, all the way down into sleep. So let us meet them properly, the people who made the lines, before the night closes over us. We call them the Nazca, after the river valley and the modern town that carry the name, though we do not know what they called themselves, for they left no writing of any kind. They flourished on the south coast of Peru for roughly 9 centuries, from somewhere around 100 years before the Common Era to about 800 years after it, which is to say they were a living, working, breathing civilization for nearly 1,000 years, longer than the span between the Norman conquest of England and the present day. They were not a vanished mystery to themselves. They were farmers and weavers and potters and priests, raising children and burying their dead, and watching the same dry stars that we have watched all night, in a desert that was every bit as harsh and beautiful then as it is now. And the land they lived in was, above all, dry. The Nazca coast is one of the driest places on the face of the earth, a thin strip of desert pinned between the cold Pacific and the high wall of the Andes, where some years no rain falls at all, where the clouds slide overhead and give nothing down. Life there was possible only in the river valleys, where water came down out of the mountains in the brief wet season and ran, for a little while, toward the sea. The Nazca learned to farm those valleys with great skill, raising maize and beans and squash, cotton for their cloth, and the gourds they painted and carried. And in the long dry stretches when the rivers ran beneath the surface rather than over it, they went underground after the water, and this is one of the most remarkable things they ever did, more remarkable in its quiet way than any line drawn on the plateau. They built the Puquios, a system of underground aqueducts, spiraling stone-lined wells and gently sloping channels that reached down into the gravel beneath the desert and drew the buried water out toward their fields. Many of these Puquios still work. After more than 1,500 years, water still flows through them, and farmers in the Nazca Valley still use them to irrigate their crops today. Stand at the mouth of one and you look down into a spiral of carefully fitted stone, descending in a tightening curl into the cool dark, and you understand at once that these were not a mysterious people fumbling toward magic. They were engineers. They understood their water and their stone and their thirsty land with a precision that has outlasted empires. When you remember the Nazca tonight, remember the Puquios first, the deep, patient cleverness of people who learned to coax a river out of the dust and keep it flowing for 1,000 years. And they were artists among the very finest of the ancient Americas. The Nazca are renowned, above all, for their pottery, and it is worth lingering on, because to hold a Nazca pot in your mind is to come about as close to these people as we can ever come. They made vessels of fired clay and painted them in extraordinary color, not 2 or 3 colors, but as many as 12 or 15 distinct shades, painted on as liquid clay slips before the pot was ever fired, so that the colors fused into the surface in the heat and have stayed bright across 2,000 years. This was a real technical advance over the people who came before them, the Paracas, who had painted their pots with resins only after firing, in colors that did not last. The Nazca painted before the fire, and their colors endured. Deep reds and oranges, warm browns, creamy whites, soft yellows, grays and purples and black, laid down in confident outlines around the rounded bellies of their bowls and jars, and the elegant double-spouted bottles they were so fond of. And what they painted is a window straight into their minds. There are hummingbirds and pelicans, killer whales and monkeys and foxes, sprouting beans and flowering plants, many of the very same creatures that walk and swim and fly across the great plateau as lines. And there are beings that were never alive at all, masked supernatural figures, long, sinuous, mythical creatures trailing severed heads and streamers, a feline-mouthed deity that appears again and again, watching out from the curve of the clay with great staring eyes. The same imagination that drew the spider and the monkey on the desert was at work here, on a surface small enough to hold in 2 hands. The lines on the plateau and the paintings on the pots are the same art, made by the same people, speaking the same visual language, and that simple fact, once you feel it, takes a great deal of the strangeness out of the lines. They are not alien signals. They are the pictures these people always made, written large. They were weavers too, and here again they inherited and surpassed the people before them. Nazca textiles are among the most technically accomplished cloth ever produced anywhere in the ancient world. Woven, embroidered, and dyed cotton and the wool of Andean animals, llama and alpaca, and the fine soft fleece of the vicuña, worked in those same rich colors, in patterns of birds and plants and gods. The weavers commanded an astonishing range of techniques, plain weave and tapestry, gauze and braid, and the intricate crossnet looping they used to edge a garment in a tiny 3-dimensional procession of figures no larger than your fingernail. In a desert that preserves almost everything it is given, cloth that would have rotted to nothing in a wetter land has survived in the dry Nazca graves for 2,000 years, the colors still holding, the knots still tied. They wrapped their dead in this cloth, layer upon careful layer, sometimes dozens of layers deep, and buried them in the dry sand in a seated position, knees drawn up, and the sand drew the moisture out of them and held them, so that the dead of the Nazca have come down to us not as bare bones but as bundles, swaddled and adorned, almost as they were laid to rest. And around those bundles they placed the things the dead would need or had loved, the painted pots, the gourds, the spindle whorls and weaving tools, panpipes of clay and bone, the long ceremonial flutes the Nazca called intaras, on which a player can still today sound the notes of a music that fell silent more than 1,000 years ago. To open a Nazca grave carefully with the reverence it deserves is to find a whole life arranged in miniature in the sand, the work a person did, the beauty they made, the music they heard, all of it dry and intact and waiting. The desert did not merely keep the lines, it kept the people and the small, ordinary tenderness of how they cared for one another at the end. The desert kept other, harder things as well, and we should not look away from them even tonight because they are part of who these people were. The Nazca made what archaeologists call trophy heads, the preserved severed heads of human beings, The skulls pierced through the forehead so they could be carried on a cord, the lips sometimes pinned shut with cactus spines. They appear in the graves, and they appear over and over in the painted pottery held in the hands of the gods. We do not fully understand what they meant, whether they were taken in war or in ritual, or whether they were tied somehow to fertility and the renewal of the land, offerings made to bring the water back. They are a reminder that the Nazca were not a gentle dream of a people, but a real human society, with a religion as fierce and strange and serious to them as any in the world has been to anyone. Their beauty and their severity belonged to the same hands. And at the heart of their world stood a place, not a great crowded city, but a holy place, and its name is Cahuachi. Cahuachi sits in the Nazca Valley a short distance from the lines, and for a long time no one understood quite what it was. It is enormous, more than 40 mounds rising from the desert floor, the largest of them a stepped pyramid of adobe brick standing some 20 meters high, sprawling across several square kilometers of sun-baked ground. For decades it has been excavated patiently and meticulously by an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Orfasai, who began his work there in the 1980s and has given much of his life to it, season after season in the dust, uncovering the adobe walls and the offerings and the buried dead. And what Orfasai and others have come to understand about Cahuachi is the quiet key to the whole puzzle. Cahuachi was not a city. Hardly anyone lived there. There are very few signs of ordinary daily life, few household middens, few of the scattered traces that crowds of permanent residents always leave behind. Instead, it seems to have been a place of pilgrimage, a great ceremonial center to which the Nazca came from across their valleys at appointed times, gathering for festivals and rituals and the burial of the honored dead, and then dispersing again, leaving the mounds empty under the sun. The pottery was smashed there deliberately as offerings. The dead were brought there to rest. It was a sacred capital without a population, a city of the gods and the ancestors rather than of the living. And the lines drawn on the plateau all around almost certainly belonged to the same sacred world. The figures in the long straight lines and the great cleared trapezoids were not idle decoration and not a message to the sky. They were very likely paths to be walked in procession, ritual roads across the desert connecting the holy places, traced out by people moving in slow ceremony toward water and the gods who gave it. When you walk the single unbroken line that forms the famous monkey or the hummingbird, you enter at one point and you leave at another, never crossing your own path, as though the very act of walking the figure were the point of it, a prayer made not with words but with footsteps, written into the desert by the body itself. People who studied these lines for a lifetime came in the end to that humble and human conclusion, that they were made to be walked by people asking the dry sky again and again across the centuries for rain. For rain because in the end it was the rain or the lack of it that undid them. The Nazca did not vanish in a single night or by any single hand. Their decline came gradually, somewhere in the centuries after about 600 of the Common Era, and it seems to have been a slow braiding together of misfortunes, most of them turning on water. There were long droughts when the rivers failed and the Puquios could not draw enough. And there were the opposite catastrophes too, the great floods of El Niño years, when the rare violent rains came down out of the mountains all at once and tore through the valleys, ripping out fields and channels and homes. A society balanced so finely on the thin edge of water could be broken from either side by too little or too much. And there is a quieter culprit that researchers have come to suspect, one that the Nazca brought upon themselves without ever knowing. The valleys had once been held together by the huarango, a remarkable desert tree, deep-rooted and long-lived, that anchored the fragile soil, fixed nitrogen to keep it fertile, held moisture in the ground, and sheltered the floodplain from the wind and the floods. Over the centuries, it appears, the Nazca cleared more and more of the huarango forests to open ground for their crops, until the protective canopy thinned past the point of recovery. And when the great El Niño floods came against a landscape stripped of the trees that had once held it, there was nothing left to hold it, and the valleys were scoured and the soil was lost. It is an old and very human story, a people slowly using up the thing that kept them alive, not out of malice but out of need, one tree at a time. By around 750 of the Common Era, the Nazca as a distinct culture had faded, absorbed into the wider currents of the Andean world, their ceremonial center long since fallen quiet. But the desert kept what they left. That is the thing to hold on to as the night comes down, that this is not in the end a mystery to be solved at all, but an inheritance that has been kept for us faithfully by by the driest land on Earth. The same rainless air that made the Nazca's lives so hard is the air that has preserved their work across 2,000 years almost untouched. The lines are still there because it almost never rains to wash them away, almost never grows to cover them over, almost never blows hard enough to scour them off the dark stones. The desert has been a patient keeper. It has held the pottery and the cloth and the buried dead in the great walked prayers on the plateau, holding them in trust through all the centuries when no one was watching, waiting, you might almost say, for us to be ready to look. And we are still looking. Even now, the desert is giving up more of what it kept. For decades, the lines were studied by a single devoted woman, the German mathematician Maria Reiche, who came to the Pampa in the 1940s and stayed for half a century, measuring and sweeping and guarding the figures almost single-handedly, sleeping in a small room near the desert and walking out among the lines with a broom to clear the stones, until she had mapped them more completely than anyone before her and very nearly given her sight and her life to the task. She showed what one patient person could do, and the work she began has now passed to teams with tools she could only have dreamed of. In recent years, a team from Yamagata University in Japan, led by the archaeologist Masato Sakai, has searched the plateau with high-resolution aerial survey and ground inspection, and more recently, with artificial intelligence trained to spot the faint traces a human eye would miss, feeding the machine the few figures already known so that it might learn their grammar and go looking for their kin. And it has found them by the hundreds, more than 300 previously unknown geoglyphs revealed in a single recent sweep, smaller figures for the most part, close beside the old footpaths, parrots and cats and monkeys and human forms and strange composite beings, all of them lying unseen and unsuspected on the desert for the better part of 2,000 years. And in 2020, on a steep hillside near the edge of the Great Plain, conservators clearing and reinforcing a path uncovered an entirely new figure that had been hiding in plain sight. A long-bodied cat, perhaps 37 meters from nose to tail, lounging across the slope with its ears pricked and its tail curled, drawn in a simple style that places it among the very oldest of all the figures, so faded by the centuries that it had nearly slipped back into the hill forever. It had been there the whole time, just above a road that thousands of people had driven past without ever once looking up. It was simply waiting to be seen. The world has not always been a gentle keeper in return, and that is worth remembering quietly, without anger. In 2014, activists from the environmental group Greenpeace walked out onto the fragile plain beside the famous Hummingbird to lay down a great cloth banner for a climate conference, and in doing so they left footprints in ground so delicate that a single careless step can scar it for centuries. The harm was real, and Greenpeace apologized to the people of Peru for the offense they had caused. And in 2018, a truck driver, ignoring the signs, drove across part of the lines and left deep tire tracks gouged into the desert. These were small wounds against something very large and very old, and they have been tended. But they remind us that the lines are not as eternal as they look, that they have survived 2,000 years of sun and silence only to become, in our own busy age, something fragile that must be deliberately protected. And so they are protected. Since 1994, the Nazca Lines have been a World Heritage Site, recognized by UNESCO and guarded as a treasure that belongs not to one country alone, but to all of us, to the whole human family, kept now by deliberate care, the way the desert once kept them by simple emptiness. So that is the answer, as much of an answer as there is, and it is a warm one to carry down into sleep. The lines were not made by gods or visitors from the stars. They were made by people, clever, devout, struggling, mortal people, who farmed a desert and wove bright cloth and painted their pots in a dozen colors and walked their long prayers across the plateau asking over and over for rain. They lived and they made beautiful things, and in time they faded the way every people fades. And the desert, which had given them so little, gave them in the end the one gift it had to give. It remembered them. It kept their work safe through all the silent centuries, so that we, 2,000 years later and half a world away, could stand at the edge of the plain in the early light and see, still drawn upon the earth, the hummingbird and the monkey and the spider and the long resting cat, exactly where they left them. And now there is nothing more to learn tonight, and nothing more to wonder, and you can let all of it go. Let the questions settle the way dust settles on the plain after the wind has passed. We do not need to solve anything. The lines have already been solved gently by patient people working in the sun, and the answer turned out to be the warmest one of all, that we were never looking at a mystery, only at the long-kept handiwork of people very much like ourselves, who looked up at the same stars and felt the same small awe and made marks to last. Picture the great plateau now in the last of the light, the way it has lain for 2,000 years. The day's heat is lifting off the dark stones and rising into a sky going from gold to rose to the deep clear violet of the high desert dusk. The wind has dropped the way it does at evening, and the long figures lie quiet on the ground, the hummingbird with its slender beak, the spider, the monkey with its curled tail, the cat on the hillside with its ears pricked toward the dark. They are not waiting for anything now. They are simply at rest, as they have rested every evening for 20 centuries, while the light leaves the plain and the cool comes up out of the sand. And the stars are coming, one by one and then in their thousands, the same stars the Nazca watched from the same ground, low and close and brilliant in the dry, clear air, with no cloud anywhere to hide them and no city glow to dim them. The desert breathes its slow, cool breath beneath them. Somewhere far off, the buried water still moves through the old stone channels in the dark, patient and unhurried, the way it has moved for 1,500 years. There is nothing out there in the night that means you any harm. There never was, only the warm sand cooling, and the lines lying quiet, and the great still sky turning slowly overhead. You are not in the desert at all. You are warm in your bed, in the dark, in the safe, ordinary quiet of the night. The Nazca have said everything they came to say, and now they are settling back into their long rest, into the kept silence of the plain, and you may let them go, gently, the way the light goes out of the desert at the end of the day, not all at once, but softly, edge by edge, until the whole plateau lies dark and at peace under the stars. Let the lines rest, let the painted pots rest in their cases and their graves, their colors still bright in the dark. Let the puquios carry their quiet water on through the night. Let Kehuachi lie still beneath its mounds, the festivals long over, the dead long honored, the dust drawn smooth across it all. Let the long cat rest on its hillside with its tail curled around it. Let the desert keep, as it has always kept, faithfully, asking nothing. And let yourself rest now, too. There is nothing left to carry. Every question has been laid down softly on the warm sand, and the night has come all the way in, and you are held, and you are safe, and there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do but breathe slowly, and let the long day go. Breathe out. Let the last of it go with the last of the light. You are warm, you are safe. The desert is keeping everything, and you can finally let it. Sleep well.